I'm checking the historical record first, so the quiet details, the apartment, the cigarette, the evidence storage, and the eventual genetic work remain accurate beneath the narration. Then I'll begin the first continuous portion without headings or recap. The Rita Curran case rests beneath your reading lamp tonight, inside a small Lark cigarette whose pale paper waited 52 years for someone to understand it. Settle in now, because neither the old file nor the quiet work ahead requires any hurry. We begin on Brooks Avenue in Burlington, Vermont, where a summer window stands partly open. Floorboards hold the warmth of the day, and the faint sounds of a university neighborhood drift through the evening. The date is the 19th of July, 1971, a Monday near the middle of a Vermont summer, when the daylight lingers and Lake Champlain softens the western horizon. If you place your hand upon the first folder, you can almost feel its worn cardboard cover and the slight roughness around the metal clasp. Inside, the Rita Curran case begins not with the cigarette, but with a young teacher arranging an ordinary life in a new apartment. Rita was 24 years old, and she had recently moved from her family home in Milton to number 17 Brooks Avenue in Burlington. It was the first time she had lived away from the familiar rooms where she had grown up, and you may imagine how even a short move can make the smallest routines feel newly uncertain. Her apartment occupied part of a converted house, with a porch, several units, and interior stairs carrying the muted sound of neighbors moving above. Brooks Avenue lay near the University of Vermont, among houses divided into apartments for students, young workers, and people beginning their adult lives. Cars rested close to the curb. Summer leaves stirred over the pavement, and screen doors made their soft wooden sound as residents came and went. As you sit beside the case file, you can picture a neighborhood that felt neither remote nor especially remarkable, which is part of what made Rita's absence so difficult to accept. She was a second-grade teacher in Milton, and the surviving photographs show a composed young woman with dark hair, a gentle expression, and a quiet manner. During the school year, children knew her as the person standing beside the chalkboard, guiding small hands through words and numbers with the patience required of every good teacher. Her family remembered her as reserved, musical, and deeply connected to the people she loved. The summer did not leave Rita idle, because she worked as a chambermaid at the Colonial Motor Inn on Shelburne Road while taking graduate courses at the university. You can imagine the clean scent of folded linen, the dry whisper of towels being stacked, and the steady movement from one motel room to another. It was practical work, done during the months before she would return to her classroom, and it belonged to the dependable rhythm she was building for herself. She also sang, joining her voice with others in a local barbershop group, where harmony depended upon listening as carefully as performing. That detail stays softly in the file, because it tells you something no laboratory result can provide. Rita knew how to hold her part, while making room for other voices. When we remember her here, we should remember the music, the classroom, and the quiet courage of moving into a life that was still taking shape. The apartment on Brooks Avenue was shared with other young women whom Rita had not known for very long, and one roommate shared the bedroom with her. Their habits were different, as they often are among people brought together by a newspaper notice and the simple need for affordable rent. Rita spent much of her free time with family and established friends, and she had already begun considering another place where she might feel more at ease. Nothing about that uncertainty was unusual, and there is no reason to cast it in darker colors than it deserves. Many first apartments are imperfect, with unfamiliar voices behind thin walls, someone sleeping on a sofa, and kitchen cupboards divided among people still learning one another's names. If you've ever lived that way, you know the gentle awkwardness of placing your cup on a shelf and wondering whether the space will ever feel like home. On the Monday preserved in the records, Rita went about the ordinary commitments of her summer, while the city moved through another warm July day. By late evening she was back at the apartment, and the rooms gradually emptied as her roommates made plans elsewhere. You turn the page slowly here, because the surviving timeline becomes unusually narrow, yet it remains a timeline assembled from commonplace actions rather than anything dramatic. At around 11:15, a telephone call came to the apartment from friends already out for the evening. One roommate answered, and Rita was understood to be sleeping in the bedroom, so the roommate left to join the others. The receiver settled back into its cradle. Footsteps passed through the apartment, and after the door closed, Rita was alone within the familiar hush of number 17 Brooks Avenue. You can let that moment remain quiet, without trying to fill it with knowledge the record does not contain. There would later be many attempts to determine who entered, how that person arrived, and whether the visitor was known or merely nearby. For now, the only certain measure is the soft movement of the clock between approximately 11:20 and midnight, a span of about 70 minutes. When the others returned, the apartment no longer felt as they had left it, and Rita was found inside the bedroom. We do not need to linger over what her friends saw, because the useful facts can be carried gently and with respect. Rita had died. The room showed signs of a struggle, and the first responsibility of everyone who entered was to preserve what remained while treating her with care. The Burlington police were summoned during the early hours of the 20th of July, when most of the surrounding windows were dark and the city had settled into sleep. Officers arrived carrying the equipment available to a small department in 1971, along with notebooks, cameras, evidence containers, and the habits taught by experience. You can almost hear subdued voices in the hallway and the scratch of a pen recording the first fixed details. Chittenden County State's Attorney Patrick Leahy came to the apartment as well, still early in a public career that would eventually extend across many decades. At that time, he was a young prosecutor facing a case that would remain with him long after the immediate work was finished. His presence in the old reports reminds us that a cold case is often carried by people who grow older while its pages remain almost unchanged. Investigators photographed the bedroom, studied the doors and windows, and recorded the position of objects that might otherwise have seemed unimportant. They collected small pieces of wood from a door, a section of linoleum, items of clothing, strands of hair, and other material whose meaning could not yet be known. As you imagine those hands working beneath bright lamps, you can feel the tackiness of fingerprint powder and smell the mingled odors of old plaster, floor wax, and summer air. A specialist searched for latent fingerprints, moving carefully across surfaces that had been touched by residents, visitors, and responding personnel. In a shared apartment, every print has a context, and context is often harder to preserve than the print itself. Nothing usable emerged that could identify the person investigators sought, Yet the effort still mattered because patient work includes recording what an examination cannot provide. The purse lying in the room still contained money and personal papers, making simple theft appear less likely as an explanation. Rita's car remained outside and showed no useful disturbance, while the apartment offered no clear account of how the visitor had arrived or departed. Each observation was entered into the growing file, where typed pages carried uneven impressions from ribbons that would slowly fade toward gray. Then, while Rita was being examined before she was taken from the apartment, a small cigarette end was noticed near her right arm. It had not been crushed beneath a shoe or pressed firmly into an ashtray, and its shape suggested that it had simply burned down and gone out. A little ash remained close by, fragile enough that an open door or hurried movement might have scattered it into nothing. The cigarette was a lark, a brand distinguished by a filter containing small pieces of charcoal, and its construction made it recognizable to anyone familiar with tobacco products of the period. Lark cigarettes were sold in the United States, though they were not among the most common brands in that part of Vermont. To the investigators, the name printed on the paper was initially more legible than the person who had left it behind. You may picture the cigarette as it entered the evidence system, lifted with deliberate care and placed inside packaging marked with the date, location, and case information. Its paper would have felt dry and light, while the filter retained material invisible to every person in the room. The collector could not know that human cells rested there, because forensic DNA profiling had not yet become part of police science or ordinary language. That absence of knowledge makes the decision to keep it especially meaningful. The officer was preserving a physical object because it might show who had been present, what brand that person preferred, or how events had unfolded inside the room. There was no promise that a future laboratory would read a biological signature from it, only the patient instinct that evidence should outlive the questions first asked of it. In 1971, the cigarette could be examined for visible qualities compared with brands used by known individuals and considered alongside witness statements. Its length, condition, ashes, and location might suggest something, but suggestion was not identification. You turn the evidence photograph toward the lamp, and the pale cylinder seems almost too ordinary to bear the weight later placed upon its filter. The original detectives had to work with interviews, timelines, physical comparisons, and the difficult human task of noticing when one account did not sit comfortably beside another. They canvassed the building and surrounding neighborhood, asking who had been awake, who had heard footsteps, and who had noticed an unfamiliar car. Doors opened onto warm hallways, screen hinges creaked, and answers were written into notebooks that smelled faintly of ink and damp paper. The people living within number 17 Brooks Avenue were natural starting points, not because proximity implied guilt, but because nearby residents might have heard or seen something useful. Investigators spoke with the occupants of the other units, including a newly married couple living above Rita. Their names entered the paperwork among many others, where they appeared without the emphasis that later knowledge would give them. The husband was William DeRuse, 31 years old, and his wife was Michelle, whom he had married only about 2 weeks earlier. They told investigators that they had been together in their apartment throughout the relevant period and had neither seen nor heard anything that helped. With two people apparently supporting the same account, their names remained part of the neighborhood canvas rather than the center of the inquiry. You can understand how that happened without judging the investigators too quickly, because every early case file is crowded with voices competing for attention. A confirmed alibi can close one narrow path, while dozens of uncertain paths remain open, and detectives must decide where limited hours should be spent. The typewriter continues in an adjoining office, keys striking paper, while the small Lark cigarette waits inside its labeled packet. The 70-minute interval shaped much of the early thinking, since Rita had been alone only briefly before her roommates returned. A person traveling from far away would have needed knowledge of her location, confidence that she was alone, and enough time to leave without being seen. Someone already close to the building would have faced fewer such difficulties, though proximity alone could never establish what had happened. As you reread the first interviews, you notice how much depends upon memory formed during an ordinary night. A witness may remember a door closing, but not the exact minute, or footsteps on stairs without knowing which landing received them. The sounds of apartment living overlap easily, water moving through pipes, a radio behind a wall, the low vibration of a car passing on the street. Detectives checked accounts and pursued names offered through interviews, tips, and speculation, while Rita's family endured a kind of waiting no case report can fully hold. Her parents and siblings had known the sound of her voice, the particular rhythm of her footsteps, and the small family habits that official language leaves outside the margins. For them, each unanswered day was not an abstraction, but another morning in which Rita remained absent. Her funeral took place later that week, and the community gathered around a family whose private loss had become public news. Newspaper pages carried Rita's photograph, while reporters described the continuing investigation and requested information from anyone who might know something. Those pages would yellow, their edges turning brittle, but the woman at the center of them remained a daughter, sister, teacher, and friend. Police followed hundreds of pieces of information over the years, some arriving immediately, and others surfacing after the case had become familiar across Vermont. A reported sighting might require a drive, an interview, and a report, only to end without a connection. You can feel the weight of those accumulating pages as the folder thickens, each sheet representing someone's time, recollection, or sincere desire to help. This is the quiet arithmetic of patient investigation. Many hours may close a single possibility, and closing it is still useful work. Detectives compare handwriting, addresses, schedules, relationships, and movements, knowing that certainty often grows by eliminating what cannot be true. The room may smell of coffee left too long on a warmer, while a wall clock advances through another uneventful afternoon. The cigarette remained among the collected items as those early leads were checked, its filter holding a profile that no contemporary instrument could reveal. It was not forgotten in the simple sense, because it remained inventoried, preserved, and connected to the Rita Curran case. Yet, evidence can be both remembered and unreadable, like a letter kept safely in a language no living person has learned to speak. During those first years, detectives considered people known to Rita, people living nearby, and individuals whose names arose from other investigations. Some possibilities appeared compelling for a time, particularly when a person's movements or history seemed to fit one part of the case, but a resemblance between circumstances is not proof, and the file could not be closed upon a feeling, however strongly that feeling was held. You return to the cigarette photograph because it offers something different from memory or intuition. A witness statement can shift with time, while a small object remains materially itself, provided that it is kept dry, labeled correctly, and protected from contamination. Even so, in that era, no detective could ask the filter for a name and expect an answer. Forensic biology in the early 1970s could classify certain bodily materials and blood groups, but it could not produce the individual genetic profiles now familiar to modern investigators. The double helix was understood scientifically, yet practical forensic typing, based upon DNA, still lay years ahead. You can imagine the evidence room shelf receiving another box, its brown surface cool beneath the clerk's hand, while the future remained unwritten. Every transfer mattered, though no one handling the box could know precisely why. A notation in an evidence ledger, a sealed envelope, or a clerk's refusal to discard an old item could preserve an opportunity for investigators not yet born into their professions. Patient detective work sometimes begins with analysis, but sometimes it begins with the quieter discipline of leaving something intact. Summer gave way to autumn in Burlington, and Rita's classroom began a new school year without her. The desks would still have been low enough for young children, with chalk dust along the board and construction paper arranged for lessons she had expected to teach. Her absence belonged to many spaces at once, and each space carried a different kind of silence. In the police department, meanwhile, the active urgency surrounding the case gradually became a longer routine of reviewing tips whenever they arrived. Detectives changed assignments, supervisors retired, and fresh officers learned the names attached to Burlington's older unresolved files. The Curran case remained present, its evidence box moving through institutional time more slowly than the people responsible for it. You can think of an archive not as a graveyard for old questions, but as a waiting room built from shelves, labels, and controlled access. The air may be cool and dry, fluorescent lights may hum overhead, and cardboard edges may soften after years of careful handling. Somewhere within that ordinary space, the Lark cigarette held the biological trace of William DeRoos without offering any visible indication of his name. For a long while, William's name carried no special weight in the preserved reports. He had lived upstairs, he had been interviewed, and his wife had supported his statement that he remained home during the narrow window. The account was written down, filed, and absorbed into a case containing many other names, which is how a crucial detail can remain present without yet becoming clear. William and Michelle left Vermont not long after Rita's death, and their marriage did not endure. William eventually traveled to Thailand, where he spent time as a monk, before returning to the United States and beginning another marriage. Those later movements lay beyond the reach of the first investigation, which had no national digital system capable of gathering a person's scattered records with a few quiet keystrokes. His life continued elsewhere, while Rita's family continued without the answer they wanted. Years became decades, and the distance between 1971 and the present widened. through birthdays, holidays, retirements, and funerals. You can turn those calendar pages gently, because the central fact is not the speed of time, but the constancy with which some people kept remembering. Rita's father died in 1991, and her mother died in 2002, each without learning whose presence had altered their family so completely. Their waiting cannot be restored or repaired by a later identification, and no responsible retelling should pretend otherwise. Still, the care given to the evidence meant that their surviving children might one day receive what the earlier generation had been denied, a grounded and carefully tested answer. Before that answer became possible, the case drew theories familiar to anyone who has watched an old mystery attract a famous name. Ted Bundy was considered because he had connections to Vermont, and because aspects of his movements invited questions from investigators and Rita's family. Yet a famous possibility can cast a long shadow, and you must sometimes move the lamp so the smaller, local details become visible again. Investigators communicated with Bundy, examined what was known about his whereabouts, and continued asking whether the connection had substance. Before his execution in 1989, he denied responsibility for Rita's death during an interview with an FBI agent. The denial did not identify the person who had been inside the apartment, and the cigarette remained more reliable than every theory built around reputation. There is something calming in the discipline required to release an explanation when the evidence will not support it. A detective may invest weeks in a name, fill pages with dates and travel records, and then quietly return the folder to its proper place. You do not need every path to reach the answer, because an honest dead end keeps the investigation from wandering in the wrong direction. As scientific methods improved, old evidence began to acquire possibilities that earlier detectives had preserved without being able to use. DNA profiling entered criminal investigations during the 1980s, offering a means of distinguishing individuals through biological material. The idea would have seemed almost improbable to the officer who lifted the Lark cigarette, yet the object had been waiting for precisely this kind of attention. The earliest forensic DNA methods often required more material than a cigarette filter could reliably provide, and they were not equally successful with aged or limited samples. Laboratories improved their techniques over time, learning to copy small regions of genetic material and build profiles from traces once considered insufficient. Each advance brought the Rita Curran evidence closer to speech, though no one could know which year would finally be the right one. You can imagine periodic reviews in which a detective opened the box, read familiar names, and considered whether the available science justified another test. Testing may consume part of a sample, so patience is not always neglect. Sometimes it is the decision to wait until a method becomes sensitive enough to return useful information. The cigarette was finite, and every laboratory request had to be made with care. Storage itself became part of the investigative method. Paper packaging allowed certain evidence to remain dry. Seals recorded whether an item had been opened, and chain of custody notes followed each transfer from shelf to desk and back again. Beneath the fluorescent hum, the small packet passed through decades without fanfare, protected by routines that rarely appear in newspaper stories. By then, officers who had entered the apartment in 1971 were growing older, and some were no longer available to explain the choices recorded in their reports. Their handwriting and typed observations had to speak for them, which made precise documentation increasingly important. You can run your attention along the lines and sense one generation of investigators leaving instructions for another without knowing who would eventually read them. Cold cases often appear motionless from outside, yet their stillness contains many small acts of maintenance. Someone answers a family member's call, someone checks a new name against the old index, and someone ensures that an evidence room reorganization does not separate an object from its record. These actions do not produce announcements, but they keep the narrow road toward an answer from quietly closing. In 2014, that road opened a little farther when Burlington detective Jeff Beerworth arranged for evidence from the Curran case to receive modern DNA testing. More than 4 decades had passed since the cigarette was collected, and its white paper had long since taken on the muted color of an archival object. You can picture the package being signed out, its seal inspected, and the old label read once more beneath a clear laboratory light. The cigarette butt traveled with other preserved material to the Office of Chief Medical Examiner in New York City, where scientists approached it as a biological sample rather than merely a discarded object. Their instruments did not care that the case was old or that generations of theories surrounded it. They searched the filter for genetic markers, working through the invisible residue left by the person who had smoked that particular lark. A cigarette filter is well suited to retaining saliva, though time, handling, moisture, and storage can all affect what remains available. The scientist's task was to recover enough material, copy selected regions, and distinguish a usable profile from any contamination or background. You can imagine the quiet laboratory sounds, a refrigerator seal releasing, pipette tips clicking into place, and ventilation moving steadily above a polished bench. The test succeeded in producing a male DNA profile, an achievement that transformed the cigarette from a suggestive clue into a potential identifier. Yet, a profile alone is not a person's name, and the National Law Enforcement Database returned no match. The result therefore entered the file under a neutral designation, an unknown individual represented by a set of genetic values and an unanswered question. That moment is important because it shows how progress can arrive without resolution. The cigarette had finally spoken in the language of modern science, but no existing record answered it. Perhaps because its smoker's DNA had never been entered into the relevant criminal databases. You sit with that result beneath the lamp, hearing the gentle turn of paper as another promising path pauses at a locked door. The detectives could exclude people whose known DNA did not fit, and that alone gave the inquiry a firmer shape. Suspects and theories accumulated across the years could be tested against something physical, reducing the field one careful comparison at a time. Still, the profile belonging to the cigarette smoker remained unattached to a name, waiting within a computer as the physical filter returned to controlled storage. William DeRoos had died in San Francisco in 1986, many years before the profile was developed. His death meant there would be no routine cheek swab, no direct interview, and no opportunity to compare his account with evidence while he sat across from a detective. If his name were ever to emerge, investigators would need a method capable of reaching sideways through family lines rather than directly toward him. That method was not yet ready for routine use in the Curran case, so the file entered another period of waiting. The waiting was different now, because investigators possessed a reliable genetic profile and understood that future databases or techniques might give it context. You can almost feel the promise contained in those printed laboratory pages, still cautious, still incomplete, but far more specific than anything the cigarette had offered before. 5 years passed, and during that interval, forensic genetic genealogy began changing the way carefully preserved evidence could be reconsidered. Instead of asking whether the unknown profile matched a convicted person directly, the newer approach could look for shared stretches of DNA among consenting genealogy database users. Those partial relationships might point toward distant cousins, common ancestors, and eventually a branch of one particular family. The work was neither instant nor mechanical, despite the simple way it is sometimes described. A genetic match might lead to an obituary, a marriage notice, a census page, or a birth record stored in a county archive far from Vermont. From those fragments, a genealogist could build family lines across generations, correcting spelling changes and distinguishing people who carried the same name. In 2019, Detective Lieutenant James Trebe and a new Burlington team returned to the Rita Curran case with the intention of treating it as if it had just occurred. That approach meant more than opening a box and ordering a single test. It meant gathering detectives, technicians, and outside specialists around the same old material, allowing several patient minds to notice connections one person might miss. You can picture the conference table beneath soft office lighting, covered with copies of reports whose original pages had become delicate. Photographs lay beside interview summaries, and the known timeline was marked again from 11:20 until midnight. In the center of this renewed work sat the DNA profile obtained from the cigarette, no longer silent, though still waiting for a family tree. The team began by examining the entire investigation, without assuming that earlier conclusions were permanent. People once treated as peripheral could be reconsidered, especially if they had lived close enough to enter and leave during the 70-minute window. As you return with them to number 17 Brooks Avenue, the interior stairs become important again, carrying only a few steps between Rita's apartment and the rooms above. William DeRuse appeared in several original reports because officers had canvassed the building and spoken with him after Rita was found. His proximity alone did not make him responsible, but it justified including him among the people whose relationship to the unknown DNA should be examined. The renewed team placed his name into a broader suspect pool, alongside others accumulated through nearly 5 decades of inquiry. There was still no stored sample taken directly from William, and the law enforcement database had already failed to identify the cigarette profile. The detectives therefore turned toward genetic genealogy, where the unknown smoker's DNA could be compared with profiles voluntarily made available for such searching. Here the case moved from the cool evidence room into a quieter landscape of family records, shared ancestors, and names written in old ledgers. A distant genetic relative does not point neatly toward one person, because each match may belong to a family containing many branches and generations. Genealogists study the amount of shared DNA, estimate the possible relationship, and then build backward until family lines meet. From that common point, they move forward again, looking for descendants of the right age, sex, location, and opportunity to fit the case. You follow this work slowly, one certificate at a time, while birthplaces and married names settle into their proper positions. A newspaper notice may connect a daughter to her parents, while an obituary identifies siblings who moved across the country. The process feels less like a sudden scientific revelation than the patient restoration of a faded map, with each verified relationship adding another careful line. The cigarette profile produced meaningful connections on both the paternal and maternal sides of William DeRuse's family. That convergence mattered because it narrowed the possible identity far more strongly than a single distant match could have done. As the branches came together, the genealogical work began pointing toward the same man whose name had rested quietly in the original neighborhood reports since 1971, the upstairs neighbor. Even then, investigators did not allow the family tree to stand alone. Genetic genealogy is an investigative lead, and a lead must be checked against ordinary evidence, timelines, records, and independent laboratory results. You place the family chart beside the Brooks Avenue interviews, and for the first time, the old statement from William and Michelle receives the full attention it had been waiting to receive. The apartment building now offered a geography that could be measured in seconds rather than miles. William was nearby during the narrow window, and the unknown cigarette smoker's genetic relatives led back toward his family from two directions. Yet, one obstacle remained inside the original report. Michelle had said her new husband was home with her throughout the relevant time. A half-century had passed since that statement, and Michelle had built a life far from the young marriage she once tried to protect. Detectives located her in Oregon and prepared to ask about an ordinary summer night that had become fixed in the history of another family. You can imagine the old report resting between them, its paper carrying the certainty of youth into a conversation shaped by age and distance. When Detective Thomas Chenette spoke with her, he did not need to recreate the urgency of 1971. The work now depended upon patience, clear questions, and room for an older witness to separate what she had said from what she remembered. Outside, Oregon air moved beyond the interview room, while the past waited without pressing against the door. Michelle explained that William had not remained in their apartment throughout the entire evening. The newly married couple had argued, and William left for what was described as a cooling-off walk before returning later. Afterward, when police came to ask questions, he instructed her to say that he had been home with her all night. She had followed that instruction, fearing trouble because William had a criminal record and believing she was protecting the man she had recently married. Detective Chenette would later express the view that she had not known what had happened to Rita. As you consider her changed account, compassion asks us to see not a convenient character in a mystery, but a young woman whose fearful decision remained buried for decades. The revised account removed the alibi that had kept William near the edge of the first investigation. It also placed his unexplained absence within the same 70-minute span when Rita was alone downstairs. The genetics and the witness history were beginning to rest beside each other, though the team still needed the physical evidence to carry more than one point of contact. That need brought investigators back once again to the preserved clothing and other materials collected from Rita's room. The evidence box opened beneath modern laboratory conditions, and items first handled in the summer of 1971 were assessed for places where another person might have left biological traces. Fabric has its own quiet geography, with seams, ties, edges, and folds preserving contact in ways the eye cannot see. In early 2022, the team separated items according to their likelihood of producing useful suspect DNA, because testing was costly and the available evidence deserved careful choices. Funding assistance helped make the additional analysis possible, allowing selected materials to travel to a specialist laboratory in Florida. Among them was Rita's housecoat, whose cloth had waited beside the cigarette through almost the entire history of the file. The laboratory received 2 reference profiles for comparison: Rita's own DNA and the male profile recovered from the Lark cigarette. Scientists then worked with mixtures where genetic material from several people may be present on the same small area of fabric. Such analysis requires restraint, because the result is expressed through statistical support rather than the simple certainty of a printed name. On the housecoat, the testing detected a mixture containing several contributors, including Rita, and a contributor consistent with the cigarette profile. The statistical strength offered substantial support for the view that the same unknown man had contributed DNA to both items. You can let those results rest side by side now, the dry paper of the report beneath your fingertips, and the quiet laboratory language carrying what the old cigarette had preserved. The wording mattered, because forensic conclusions are strongest when they remain within the boundaries of what the testing can truly support. The laboratory did not claim that cloth remembered an entire event, nor that one result could explain every movement inside the room. It simply showed that biological material consistent with the cigarette smoker appeared upon Rita's housecoat, giving the investigation another independent point of connection. A portion of Rita's underclothing was also examined, and there the scientists found a mixture involving 3 genetic contributors. One was Rita, while another was consistent with the unknown male profile recovered from the Lark filter many years earlier. The statistical support was more limited than it had been upon the housecoat, yet the results still pointed gently in the same direction. On the housecoat, the comparison was approximately 65,000 times more likely if the unknown cigarette smoker had contributed to the mixture than if an unrelated person had done so. On the other item, the ratio was approximately 61 times more likely, which the laboratory described with appropriately cautious language. You don't have to hold those figures tightly in your mind. It is enough to understand that separate pieces of evidence were beginning to agree. Other tested materials produced only Rita's profile, or results that could not move the inquiry forward, which is common when old evidence is examined. A wooden fragment may preserve nothing useful, while cloth stored in the same box may retain microscopic material for half a century. You can hear the subdued laboratory refrigerator and the faint rustle of protective sleeves as each result is recorded, whether helpful or silent. Negative findings were not treated as failures, because every trustworthy investigation must preserve the difference between absence and contradiction. A sample without William's profile did not necessarily mean he had never touched a nearby object, only that recoverable material was not found there. The detectives continued building their case from converging facts, allowing no single piece to carry more weight than it could bear. The housecoat comparison was especially significant, because it tied the cigarette smoker to an item Rita had been wearing, rather than merely placing him somewhere inside a shared apartment. A visitor might leave a cigarette in a kitchen or living room for any number of ordinary reasons. The location of the butt and the additional contact found upon the clothing made that innocent explanation increasingly difficult to maintain. Still, you can imagine the detectives resisting the temptation to move too quickly. They had inherited a case shaped by 50 years of uncertainty, and they understood that a deceased suspect could neither answer questions nor challenge their conclusions in court. That absence placed a greater duty upon the team to test alternatives carefully and write every inference in measured terms. They reviewed the chain of custody again, following the cigarette from the Brooks Avenue bedroom through evidence storage and into successive laboratories. Each signature and date helped show that the profile had not appeared through an unexplained transfer or careless handling. The paper trail, once a routine administrative record, now became part of the scientific foundation beneath the identification. As you trace those entries with your finger, you may notice how many quiet workers stand behind a successful cold case result. One officer notices an object, another packages it, a property clerk protects it, and a later detective chooses the right moment to test it. None can see the entire path, yet each person keeps the next step possible through simple, disciplined care. The Rita Curran case had waited long enough for several fields of knowledge to meet inside the same file. Traditional interviews supplied the 70-minute window, forensic biology connected the cigarette to Rita's clothing, and genealogical research pointed toward William DeRue's. Residence records then placed him upstairs, while Michelle's revised account removed the alibi that had once kept him outside the central frame. No one element arrived with the sudden noise of a courtroom revelation. Instead, the evidence gathered like lamplight spreading across a desk, first reaching the cigarette, then the family tree, then the old interview, and finally the preserved fabric. You sit beside the investigators as the once separated pages begin to form a single, coherent pattern. To understand why the genealogical result deserved confidence, the team considered both sides of William's family. A match, connected through only one ancestral line, might point towards several relatives who shared that branch. Connections through his maternal and paternal families narrowed the possibilities until the unknown smoker appeared at the place where those two lines met. One particular person. The genealogist's working pages may have contained names from generations far removed from Burlington, along with dates gathered from public records and family notices. Birth certificates carried formal script, census pages placed households together, and obituaries supplied relationships omitted elsewhere. Each record had to be checked, because one mistaken marriage or duplicated name could turn an entire branch away from the truth. You can picture the family tree growing across a computer screen, its lines extending outward before turning patiently inward again. Some relatives had remained in one state, while others had crossed the country, leaving records in courthouses, newspapers, and cemetery indexes. The work was quiet, repetitive, and exact, much like restoring a torn document one fiber at a time. Investigative genetic genealogy does not mean that a distant relative has accused anyone simply by submitting DNA. The relative's profile provides a measure of shared inheritance, which researchers then interpret alongside public documents and ordinary detective work. In the Rita Curran investigation, Those distant contributions functioned like signposts, pointing toward a family without declaring which member had smoked the cigarette. The detectives still had to determine which descendants could have been in Burlington in July of 1971. Age excluded some, geography excluded others, and records of residence narrowed the field further. William DeRoos fit the necessary conditions with unusual precision, because he had occupied the same small apartment building during the exact period preserved in the original timeline. When his name first surfaced strongly through the family tree, the discovery must have felt both new and strangely familiar. He was not an unknown drifter entering the file after 50 years, but a man whose interview had rested inside it from the beginning. You turn back through the brittle reports and find him there, upstairs, close enough for the journey between apartments to take only moments. That return to an old name is one of the most contemplative parts of cold case work. A person can be present on page 20 for decades, while the information needed to understand the page has not yet been invented. The document does not change, but the questions asked of it become more precise, and a sentence once passed over begins to carry a different weight. The investigators read William and Michelle's early statements alongside her later recollection, noting both agreement and difference. In 1971, the couple had said that William remained home, but decades later, Michelle remembered an argument and his departure for a walk. She also remembered the instruction that followed his return, asking her to conceal the fact that he had gone out. Memory, after so many years, requires careful handling, and the detectives did not treat recollection as if it were a recording. They considered whether outside information might have influenced her, whether the timeline remained plausible, and whether independent evidence supported what she said. The cigarette profile, residence records, and genetic family tree supplied that independent structure, allowing memory to rest within something more stable than memory alone. Michelle's explanation also carried the ordinary confusion of a very young marriage. She had known William for a short time, understood that he had encountered legal trouble before, and believed a false alibi might protect him from suspicion. The detectives later made clear that they did not think she knowingly concealed Rita's death, a distinction grounded in both evidence and human compassion. You can sit with that distinction without excusing the false statement or placing upon Michelle knowledge she may never have possessed. People sometimes make consequential choices under pressure without understanding the larger truth surrounding them. By returning to the conversation after half a century, she gave investigators a fact that the young woman of 1971 had not been prepared to give. The room in Oregon where that interview occurred was far removed from Brooks Avenue, yet the old apartment was quietly present between every question and answer. A recorder may have rested upon the table, its small indicator light steady, while Detective Chenette listened. Outside, traffic passed, and ordinary life continued, as it had continued through all the years the alibi remained unchallenged. After the interview, detectives could place William away from his own apartment during the interval when Rita was alone. They could not reconstruct every minute of his walk, and they did not need to invent details absent from the record. The important change was simpler. The statement that had once accounted for his whereabouts could no longer be treated as true. The team then studied William's later life, not to turn biography into proof, but to see whether other witnesses could provide relevant context. He had left Vermont, traveled abroad, and eventually returned to the western United States. Records followed him imperfectly across places and years, leaving addresses, marriages, and scattered accounts that investigators had to assemble with restraint. A later wife described sudden and troubling outbursts during their relationship, information that helped investigators assess whether the behavior alleged in Burlington was inconsistent with everything otherwise known about him. Such accounts cannot identify the smoker of a cigarette, and the detectives did not use them as a substitute for DNA. They belonged behind the physical findings, offering context after the central identification had already begun to form. We need not linger upon the details of those later incidents, because the purpose here is not to turn suffering into atmosphere. It is enough to know that another person remembered instability and unprovoked aggression, and that her account was documented. You close that interview folder gently, leaving its sharper particulars where they belong, while keeping only the relevant human truth. William's journey to Thailand and his period as a monk introduced an outwardly different chapter in his life, though investigators found no reason to treat it as an explanation. People change countries, beliefs, clothing, and names for many reasons, and those changes do not prove what happened on an earlier night. The case remained anchored to evidence rather than the suggestive shape of a later story. He eventually returned to the United States and lived in California, where his life ended in a San Francisco hotel in 1986. He died from a drug overdose at 46 years old, approximately 15 years after Rita's death. By the time Burlington investigators obtained the cigarette profile in 2014, there had been no living suspect available for direct comparison. That fact required the team to seek confirmation through relatives and records instead of through William himself. A direct reference sample would ordinarily provide a clean comparison, with an analyst assessing whether the genetic markers corresponded to the unknown profile. Without it, investigators had to create a more careful structure from genealogy, circumstance, additional evidence, and the testimony of people who had known him. They also considered whether William might have smoked a lark cigarette in Rita's apartment innocently at some earlier time. Shared buildings can produce casual visits, borrowed objects, and small social interactions that vanish from memory. Yet there was no established relationship explaining his cigarette beside Rita, and the additional DNA upon her clothing made an unrelated visit a less persuasive possibility. The condition of the cigarette itself contributed quietly to that assessment. It had not been crushed out in an ashtray or carried from elsewhere as ordinary rubbish, but appeared to have burned down where it was found. Ash remained beneath it, suggesting that it had smoldered and gone out within the room, rather than being transported there after use by another person. You can imagine the final ember slowly losing its warmth on the floor, though we should not claim to know precisely when it fell. The physical condition allowed investigators to infer that the smoker had likely been present close to the relevant period. It was a modest inference, but cold cases are often resolved through modest facts that reinforce one another with unusual consistency. The Lark brand added another descriptive detail without carrying enough weight to identify anyone by itself. Its charcoal filter was distinctive, and the brand held a smaller share of the American market than more familiar cigarettes. Investigators could ask whether known individuals smoked larks, but habits change. Packages are shared, and a brand preference can never equal a genetic profile. What mattered most was the material caught within that filter, deposited by the smoker's mouth and protected through decades of storage. The charcoal granules, designed for an entirely different purpose, sat behind paper that absorbed moisture and cells. Neither manufacturer nor smoker could have imagined that the discarded end would one day serve as a tiny biological archive. As you hold the evidence photograph beneath the lamp, the cigarette seems almost weightless compared with the folders surrounding it. Yet physical size has little relationship to evidentiary value, because a trace too small to see may distinguish one family line from millions of others. The careful collector in 1971 preserved that possibility without receiving any assurance that it would ever mature. There is patience in science as well as in detective work. Polymerase chain reaction techniques had to develop. Short tandem repeat analysis had to become reliable. Databases had to grow, and genealogical methods had to learn how to interpret distant relationships responsibly. The Curran cigarette waited through each advance, offering no more than the science of a given decade could safely read. When the original male profile was entered into the National Criminal Database, the absence of a match might have discouraged a less patient team. Instead, investigators recognized that a database searches only among the people represented within it. A person without a qualifying profile can remain invisible to that system, even when a complete genetic pattern sits ready for comparison. Genetic genealogy changed the nature of the search by using inherited relationships rather than requiring an exact identity match. If you share DNA with a distant cousin, the shared sections may point backward toward common ancestors, though they do not announce precisely how you are related. Researchers must calculate possible relationships, build documentary trees, and then test each branch against known facts. This is where traditional archives return to the center of a high-technology investigation. A digital DNA match might lead to a paper marriage license, and that license might lead to a surname found in a decades-old newspaper. The faint smell of bound volumes and the cool glow of a computer screen belong to the same method, separated by appearance, but joined through patient verification. The genealogist working with the cigarette profile had to distinguish biological relationships from social records as well. An adoption, an informal name change, or an incorrectly recorded parent could alter the expected shape of a tree. Each uncertainty called for another document, another comparison, and sometimes another relative whose shared DNA could confirm which branch was accurate. When matches appeared on both sides of William's family, the tree gained a kind of balance. One line led toward his father's relatives, and another led toward his mother's, bringing the unknown profile toward their descendants. Among the people at that intersection, William alone carried the necessary connection to Burlington, Brooks Avenue, and the summer of 1971 with such precision. The detectives did not have to rely upon a single commercial database holding every person's private information, as simplified accounts sometimes suggest. Genealogy searches operate through profiles made available under specific policies, and the resulting matches may be quite distant. The case was narrowed through research, not through a machine displaying William's name beside the word match. You can think of the process as beginning with several dim points, far apart on a map. The genealogist draws careful lines between them, moving through generations until a family structure appears, while detectives add locations and dates. Gradually, one figure stands where the genetic and historical maps overlap, not because the computer accused him, but because many verified paths reached the same place. The team also worked to eliminate other men who might plausibly fit portions of the family tree. Age, residence, and relationship records helped distinguish William from brothers, cousins, and other relatives sharing parts of his ancestry. This elimination was essential because a genealogical association to a family cannot responsibly be presented as identification until alternative family members have been considered with care. Some candidates would have been too young, too old, or documented far from Vermont during the relevant summer. Others lacked the combination of maternal and paternal relationships reflected in the DNA. William remained not only genetically connected, but physically present in the building. His name already preserved in reports created before genealogy databases or modern profiling existed. That independence gave the evidence unusual strength. The 1971 officers could not shape their notes around a future DNA result, and the modern genealogists did not begin with a famous suspect whose identity they were trying to confirm. Two separate pathways, created decades apart, arrived at the same upstairs resident through different kinds of information. As you let those pathways settle together, you can hear the quiet discipline of corroboration. A good investigator does not ask whether one clue feels convincing, but whether unrelated sources agree without being forced. Residence records, genetic inheritance, the altered alibi, the cigarette's location, and the clothing results each approached William from a different angle. The team reviewed the original suspect list as well, comparing known reference samples where possible and assessing whether any earlier theory could explain the new findings. 13 people had remained within the broader group of possibilities considered during the renewed inquiry. The cigarette profile helped remove those whose DNA did not fit, allowing old suspicions to be set down rather than carried forward through habit. For the people excluded, that work mattered deeply, even if they had died without knowing the final result. A name in a cold case file can cast a private shadow across families, especially when rumor repeats what evidence never established. Scientific exclusion returns those names to their proper place, which is another quiet form of investigative justice. The possibility involving Ted Bundy could also be left behind with greater confidence. Whatever uncertainty had once surrounded his travel or statements, the cigarette profile did not lead toward his family, while the combined evidence pointed to a resident within Rita's own building. The famous distant theory gave way to the less visible local fact, as so often happens when evidence is allowed to guide. You turn from the Bundy correspondence back to the neighborhood canvas, and the contrast is striking without needing any drama. One trail had attracted attention because the name was widely known, while the other had waited in ordinary typed pages. The answer was not hidden beyond Burlington, after all. It had been living 2 floors above Rita within the same narrow house. Even this statement requires a little care, because accounts differ in casual descriptions of the building's internal arrangement. What remains clear is that William occupied an upstairs unit within the same divided property at number 15 and number 17 Brooks Avenue. For the investigation, the essential fact was nearness, the short distance between his residence and Rita's room. Old apartment houses can carry sound unpredictably, with a quiet conversation traveling through a vent, while heavier footsteps disappear into thick wood. Residents learn which stair treads creak and how firmly a door must be pulled before its latch catches. William's familiarity with the building would have reduced the uncertainty facing a stranger, though familiarity itself remained context rather than direct proof. The narrow timeline became more meaningful once Michelle's account changed. William's cooling-off walk placed him outside his apartment while Rita was alone, and his instruction afterward suggested that he wanted the absence concealed. Investigators considered this behavior beside the DNA instead of treating it as a confession, because even a troubling statement must retain its proper evidentiary size. Michelle remembered that the instruction came when police later knocked upon their door, and that William referred to his previous criminal history as the reason she should protect him, to a newly married woman. That explanation may have sounded plausible enough to obey. Only after decades of distance could she view the request from outside the emotional atmosphere in which it had first been made. You might imagine the younger Michelle hearing officers on the stairs, her apartment carrying the stale smell of cigarette smoke and the lingering discomfort of an argument. Yet we should keep imagined texture separate from established fact, as every careful detective must. What the record supports is that William left, returned, and obtained an alibi that Michelle later withdrew in her conversation with police. The renewed detectives assessed her demeanor and account, looking for details that could be compared with the original reports. They did not believe she had known William was responsible for Rita's death, and they said so publicly when the investigation was eventually explained. That judgment preserved an important boundary between a frightened lie and knowing participation in another person's crime. For Rita's surviving brother and sister, the investigation moved at a pace both hopeful and difficult. New testing could promise an answer, yet cold case families often learn not to trust every promising development until the evidence has been fully reviewed. A telephone ringing in the afternoon can carry hope, caution, and decades of remembered disappointment before anyone even says the detective's name. The police maintained contact while laboratories completed their work and genealogists checked the tree. Results did not arrive in the order a story might prefer, and some required additional explanation before they could be shared responsibly. You can feel the long pauses between those calls, with the evidence moving through technical steps, while family life continued around the waiting. Rita's siblings had grown older than Rita was ever allowed to become. They carried childhood memories of a sister who sang, taught, and returned often to the family home in Milton, while photographs held her at 24. An identification could answer who had been responsible, but it could not supply the years, conversations, or family occasions that had been lost. That is why patient compassion belongs beside patient science in this file. The laboratory result concerns alleles, mixtures, and probabilities, while the family's question concerns a person they loved. Both languages are necessary, but they are not interchangeable, and the detectives had to translate between them without turning Rita into nothing more than a sample number. The best way to keep her present was to return often to the ordinary shape of her life. She prepared classrooms, took graduate courses, cleaned motel rooms during summer, and practiced close harmony with other singers. You can imagine sheet music held between careful hands, pencil marks beside difficult passages, and several voices searching together for the warm center of a chord. Her teaching offers another image, quieter still. A second-grade room contains blunt pencils, low chairs, paper with broad lines, and children learning that patient repetition can make something difficult become familiar. Rita's own case would eventually depend upon that same humble principle, as investigators returned to the same evidence until the available tools finally became ready. The cigarette had survived because someone in 1971 believed a small object deserved a label and a place on the shelf. The housecoat had survived for the same reason, along with reports whose wording allowed later detectives to reconstruct interviews they had never attended. Preservation was not passive storage, it was an extended act of faith in future methods. You can almost feel the difference between the materials beneath your hands. The cigarette packet is light and faintly brittle. The fabric is folded within protective wrapping, and the reports carry the dry softness of paper turned many times. Together, they show how a case can remain physical through decades, when most living memories have grown less certain. August of 2022. The genealogical work was pointing firmly toward William DeRuse, and the additional testing strengthened the link between the cigarette profile and Rita's clothing. Detectives reviewed what could still be checked, including travel histories, marriage records, and interviews with people who had known William later. The answer was becoming clearer, though the team continued to move at the pace required by evidence. They had to decide not only what they believed, but what they could explain transparently to Rita's family and the public. Because William was dead, there would be no arrest, preliminary hearing, or trial in which separate pieces were presented under courtroom rules. The police would therefore carry the responsibility of showing why they considered the identification strong enough to close Burlington's oldest cold case. That responsibility encouraged another review of alternative explanations. Could the cigarette have arrived through innocent contact? Could the clothing mixture be coincidental? Or could another relative account for the genealogical pattern? Each question was placed against the known facts, and each required a response grounded in records rather than confidence alone. An innocent visit would not readily explain the location and condition of the cigarette, the narrow time window, the additional DNA upon clothing, and the false alibi obtained after William returned. Another relative would need the correct genetic position while also occupying the same Burlington building at the same time. The alternatives became less reasonable as the independent pieces settled into alignment. Still, the investigators could not know every word spoken inside Rita's room or every thought carried by William during his absence. Solving who was responsible did not restore a complete minute-by-minute account. You leave those unknown details unfilled because respectful narration does not decorate the gaps that evidence has honestly preserved as gaps. The team's confidence rested upon identity and responsibility, not upon an invented reconstruction. They knew the unknown male profile belonged genetically within William's family lines, that William had lived upstairs, and that his alibi had been false. They knew the same profile appeared upon the cigarette and was supported upon Rita's clothing, giving the conclusion a firm, layered foundation. Before any public announcement, Rita's surviving family needed to hear what the investigation had found. Such a conversation cannot be reduced to delivering a suspect's name, because every answer awakens older questions and memories. Detectives would have to explain the cigarette, the DNA, the family tree, Michelle's interview, and the fact that William had been dead for many years. You can picture the documents arranged in a calm order before that meeting, each page ready to answer a different question. A family tree explains why one name emerged, a floor plan explains his proximity, and the laboratory reports explain why the cigarette mattered. Nearby, a photograph of Rita restores the reason all those careful pages had been gathered in the first place. The news could provide clarity, but it could not provide the form of accountability that a living suspect might face. There would be no opportunity for Rita's siblings to hear testimony tested before a jury or to watch a sentence entered into a court record. The investigation therefore approached closure with an unavoidable mixture of relief, loss, and lateness. For the detectives, that lateness did not make the work meaningless. An answer can still correct the historical record, remove suspicion from others, and tell a family that the person they loved was never forgotten. It can also show future investigators why preserving a seemingly minor object matters, even when current science offers no way to use it. The old Lark cigarette had become an example of evidence waiting across generations, but it remained first and foremost part of Rita Curran's personal story. Its value did not come from novelty alone, nor from the remarkable number of years it survived. Its value came from the way it connected one unknown presence to one named neighbor through disciplined and repeatable work. As the investigators prepared their findings, they returned once more to the original photographs and reports from Brooks Avenue. The summer room appeared in black and white, flattened by the camera, yet still holding small details recorded before anyone could understand their future importance. You sit with them beneath the low lamp, turning another page while the cigarette's pale outline waits near the edge of the frame. The photograph cannot tell you what the room sounded like before the police arrived, and it cannot preserve the warmth of that July night. It can only hold position, distance, and visible condition, which are quieter forms of memory. Beside it, the evidence log supplies dates and signatures, allowing the object in the image to continue forward through institutional time. A modern analyst reading that log sees more than a chain of possession. Each entry marks a moment when loss, mishandling, or disposal did not occur, and when someone accepted responsibility for keeping the packet secure. 52 years were crossed through those uneventful acts, one shelf assignment and sealed transfer after another. The cigarette itself changed very little in appearance, while the world around it changed almost completely. Typewriters gave way to computers. Paper indexes became searchable databases, and forensic laboratories learned to read smaller and more complicated samples. Detectives who began their careers after Rita's death eventually inherited tools the first investigators could scarcely have imagined. Yet the solution did not make the original work obsolete. Without the first photographs, interviews, timeline, and preservation decisions, the modern DNA result would have lacked context. Science could identify a family line, but the old canvas placed William upstairs, and Michelle's revised statement placed him outside his apartment during the crucial interval. This partnership across time is one of the gentlest lessons within the Curran file. The first detectives gathered what they could. Later detectives asked new questions, and laboratory scientists translated an invisible trace into information. No generation solved the case alone, even though each worked without knowing exactly how the next would continue the task. You can imagine their names appearing across reports, written in different fonts and decades. Some signatures are hurried, some typed titles have changed, and newer pages carry the clean uniformity of digital printing. All of them converge upon the same small item collected from the floor before dawn on the 20th of July, 1971, and preserved under the same case number. The family tree pages added another kind of time, stretching backward through ancestors who had never heard of Burlington or Rita Curran. Their inherited DNA passed quietly through generations, until distant descendants chose to make portions available for genealogical comparison. Those decisions, unrelated to the case when made, eventually helped researchers identify where the unknown smoker belonged within one family. There is no need to imagine DNA as a portrait or a perfect record of a person. It is better understood here as a set of inherited markers, some shared with close relatives and smaller portions shared with distant ones. The genealogist measured those relationships, then relied upon ordinary documents to move from biological possibility toward historical identity. At each stage, the team asked whether the documentary family tree matched the genetic expectations. If two people were predicted to share a certain ancestral connection, their amount of shared material needed to remain compatible with that relationship. Where uncertainty appeared, researchers looked for another record or another branch, preferring verification over an elegant but unsupported assumption. This methodical pace suited the Rita Curran case, which had already taught investigators that a convenient answer could persist too long. William's original alibi had sounded complete because another person supported it, yet it concealed a period when he was absent. The renewed inquiry therefore treated every apparent certainty as something to be checked against independent evidence. The cigarette profile had no interest in preserving an old agreement between spouses. It remained unchanged whether Michelle spoke in 1971 or reconsidered her account 50 years later. That stability allowed her revised memory to be evaluated without asking the memory to carry the entire burden of proof. Likewise, the later accounts of William's behavior could support context without becoming the center of the case. Investigators did not reason that a person who had behaved violently elsewhere must therefore be responsible in Burlington. They began with the DNA and the location, then considered whether the broader history contradicted or supported the emerging picture. You place those later interviews farther down the stack, where supporting material belongs. At the top remain the cigarette, the housecoat, the family tree, the apartment records, and the altered alibi. Their order on the desk mirrors their order in the reasoning, keeping the most objective findings closest to the warm circle of light. Outside that circle, many old tips could finally grow quiet. Names once written in capital letters, underlined in pencil, or linked by uncertain arrows, no longer needed to remain suspended beneath suspicion. The renewed work did not erase the effort spent checking them, but it allowed the file to distinguish clearly between paths explored and the person ultimately identified. One by one, investigators could explain why earlier possibilities had not endured. Some lacked opportunity, some were excluded genetically, and others had entered the case through rumor rather than evidence. This sorting was not merely housekeeping. It restored proportion to a file that had absorbed half a century of speculation and public memory. The Brooks Avenue building remained the stable geographical center through all of it. Rita's bedroom, the interior stairs, and William's upstairs apartment formed a small physical world within which the crucial 70 minutes passed. You can almost feel the polished stair rail beneath your hand as you return to the old floor plan, moving carefully from one marked room to the next. Investigators could estimate distance, but they could not recover sound. No recording preserved a footstep, a door latch, or a voice from that night, and no later theory should pretend otherwise. What survived was more durable in another way. Physical material on a filter, recorded statements, and evidence gathered before memory had time to fade. The first officers may have regarded the cigarette mainly as an object that could be associated with a smoker through habit or circumstance. They would have looked at its brand, degree of burning, and placement, perhaps asking witnesses whether Rita or her roommates smoked larks. Their questions were sensible for the period, even though the filter held an answer beyond their technical reach. Later, investigators asked an entirely different question of the same object. They no longer needed to know who preferred the brand, because the saliva residue could reveal a genetic profile independent of personal habit. The object had not changed, but the language available for questioning it had become vastly more precise. Then genealogy altered the question once more. Instead of asking whether the profile already had a name in a criminal database, researchers asked which families shared portions of its inheritance. That shift turned a failed exact search into a network of partial relationships, each one small but useful when placed beside the others. The process required patience after the apparent breakthrough, because distant matches often generate broad trees containing hundreds or thousands of people. Researchers had to move through those branches without becoming attached to the first promising surname. You can hear the quiet clicking of a mouse, the soft turn of archival pages, and a pencil noting another confirmed date. Eventually, the tree narrowed toward William from both sides, and the original case file supplied what genealogy alone could not: opportunity and place. A genetic researcher might identify the correct family, but only police records could show that one member lived above Rita during the relevant summer. The old and new records met at Brooks Avenue with uncommon clarity. The detectives then returned to the building's occupants, as if beginning the canvas again, although 50 years had transformed everyone's circumstances. Some witnesses had died, some could not be located, and others carried only fragments of memory. The team accepted those limits and worked with what remained, because patient inquiry does not demand that time surrender everything it has taken. Michelle's recollection survived clearly enough to alter the understanding of William's movements. Her statement did not supply an admission from him, nor did it describe what he had done while away. It did something narrower and essential. It showed that his 1971 alibi had been constructed at his request and could no longer be trusted. With that barrier removed, the physical evidence stood in a different relation to his name. The unknown profile was no longer connected merely to a family containing many possible men, but to a man who had been unaccounted for beside the scene. The facts did not need dramatic language. Their calm arrangement carried sufficient force. As the team prepared to speak with Rita's family, they would have known that technical clarity does not make emotional conversations simple. The phrase, investigative genetic genealogy, may sound distant until it is followed by the name of someone who lived upstairs. Then the science becomes immediate, entering a family history that has remained unfinished for more than half a century. Rita's brother Tom and her sister Mary had spent those years with different memories and different ways of carrying the unanswered case. Any new information also belonged to their parents, who had died without receiving it. The detectives could not give the answer to those who had waited longest, and that knowledge remained quietly present in the room. There would be time later for a public explanation, questions from reporters, and an official decision about the status of the investigation. Before that, the work remained personal and procedural, with reports checked once more and laboratory language translated into ordinary words. You turn the next page beside the detectives, where a family notification plan rests above another copy of the cigarette profile. The notification plan asked a practical question that carried 52 years of feeling. Who should speak first, and how should the evidence be explained without letting technical language obscure Rita herself? Detectives gathered the family relationships, current telephone numbers, and notes from earlier conversations into one orderly place. Before the public heard William DeRuse's name, Rita's brother and sister would hear it in private. There is a particular kind of stillness before such a call, when a detective knows that an old uncertainty is about to change, but cannot know how the listener will receive that change. The telephone feels heavier than usual, and even familiar office sounds seem to settle farther away. You can imagine the reports open nearby, ready to support each careful sentence with something more durable than hope. Rita's family had heard possible explanations before, including theories involving distant suspects and names that attracted public attention without resolving the evidence. They had learned to hold new developments cautiously, because an encouraging lead can disappear after comparison or testing. This time, the detectives could describe several independent findings that had converged upon the same upstairs neighbor. The family was told that genetic genealogy had connected the cigarette smoker to both sides of William DeRuse's family. They learned that he had lived within the Brooks Avenue building, and that his former wife no longer supported the alibi recorded in 1971. They also heard that male DNA consistent with the cigarette profile had been found upon Rita's preserved clothing. No single sentence could contain what those facts meant after half a century. An answer had arrived, yet it had arrived after Rita's parents had died and after William was beyond the reach of any courtroom. The siblings could know who police believed was responsible, but they could not watch the ordinary legal process, ask its questions, and enter a judgment into the record. You may sit quietly with that imperfect form of resolution, because cold case answers often arrive with missing pieces that time cannot return. The science can name a person while leaving the family's lost years untouched, and a completed investigation cannot recreate the hearing of Rita's voice. What it can do is end one particular uncertainty and place responsibility where the evidence says it belongs. The detectives gave the family time before preparing their public announcement. There were details to absorb, questions to ask, and older memories awakened by the mention of the apartment, the upstairs couple, and the cigarette. A conversation that begins with laboratory findings may soon return to a mother waiting by a telephone or a father reading another newspaper article at the kitchen table. Rita's brother, Tom, would later speak less about William than about Rita and their parents. That emphasis feels true to the long life of the case because the person responsible had occupied enough of the family's history already. Tom's thoughts remained with those he loved, and with the years his parents carried their unanswered grief in silence. Mary Curran Campbell remembered Rita through family life and music, details warmer than anything inside an evidence inventory. Sisters can remember the pitch of a laugh, the way a song began, or the small expressions a formal photograph never catches. The identification gave Mary a name for the unknown man, but her sister had always been more fully named and known than he. As the public announcement approached, Burlington police prepared a presentation that would explain the investigation from 1971 through the final DNA work. This required reducing shelves of reports into a sequence people could follow without oversimplifying the science. You can picture photographs being selected, dates checked, and names pronounced softly in an almost empty conference room. The department also had to describe its conclusion with precision, since William had never been arrested, tried, or convicted in Rita's case. Police could state that their investigation identified him, and that they were confident he was responsible. But they could not speak as though a jury had returned a verdict. That legal distinction remained important, even when the evidentiary picture appeared strong. A deceased suspect cannot offer an alternative account, permit a fresh reference sample, or face cross-examination. For that reason, the team's public confidence needed to rest upon a transparent explanation of how separate findings supported one another. The cigarette, genealogy, fabric testing, location, timeline, and withdrawn alibi would be presented as interconnected evidence rather than a single dramatic reveal. On the 21st of February 2023, people gathered at Burlington Police Headquarters to hear what the renewed investigation had found. Winter lay outside, far removed from the warm July night when the case began, and coats carried traces of cold air into the room. Cameras rested on tripods, while papers were arranged upon a table beneath clear overhead light. Rita's brother and sister attended, as did Patrick Leahy, who had entered the Brooks Avenue apartment as Chittenden County State's Attorney more than 51 years earlier. He was now retired after a long career in the United States Senate, his presence marking the extraordinary distance between the first response and the final identification. You can see how one case can accompany an entire working life. Acting Police Chief John Murad spoke about the original investigators' careful collection and preservation of evidence. He emphasized that their work had allowed later science to ask questions unavailable in 1971. The acknowledgement was more than ceremony, because the cigarette profile could not have existed without the quiet competence of those first officers and evidence clerks. Detective Lieutenant James Trebe explained the renewed team's decision to approach the Rita Curran case as though it had just occurred. Instead of placing the old file upon one detective's desk, he had gathered a group whose different experience could illuminate different parts. That collaborative method brought fresh attention to the timeline, the upstairs residence, and the potential of forensic genealogy. The presentation moved carefully through the history of the Lark cigarette, from its discovery near Rita's right arm to the male profile recovered in 2014. The first database search had returned nothing, but the absence of a match had not ended the inquiry. Years later, genealogy transformed the unknown profile into a path leading through relatives toward William DeRoos's family. Trieb also explained how the physical evidence had been divided for further testing, with priority given to items most likely to retain material from the unknown man. Funding support helped send those items to a specialist laboratory, where Rita's housecoat produced strong statistical support for the cigarette smoker's contribution. The restrained words of the laboratory report carried steadily across the press room. Detective Thomas Chenette described the later interview with Michelle and the reason investigators believed her account. She had acknowledged that William left their apartment after an argument, returned during the relevant period, and instructed her to conceal his absence. Chenette also conveyed his belief that the young Michelle had not known the larger truth she was unknowingly helping to hide. William's subsequent life was outlined only insofar as it helped establish identity and context. He left Vermont, spent time abroad, returned to the United States, and eventually died in San Francisco in 1986. Since he could no longer be prosecuted, the police announcement concerned historical responsibility and administrative closure rather than an arrest or impending trial. The room received the name without the noise that sometimes accompanies a major announcement. Reporters wrote, cameras recorded, and family members listened while a person from an old canvas became the identified suspect. You can imagine the faint movement of paper and the small mechanical sounds of camera shutters, each registering a conclusion built from decades of patience. When Trieb expressed the department's confidence that William DeRoos was responsible, he also acknowledged that William's death prevented formal accountability. The case would be closed by police, but the word closed could not mean that every emotional or historical question had vanished. It meant that investigators believed the available evidence had answered the central question of identity. For Patrick Leahy, the announcement returned him to a night from the beginning of his career. He had continued to remember Rita and her family even as his public work moved far beyond Vermont courtrooms. After 20, 30, and 40 years, he had doubted that the answer would arrive, which made the patient chain from cigarette to name especially striking. You can place the young prosecutor and the retired senator beside each other in your mind, separated by the long middle of a life. One stands in a summer apartment while officers collect a small cigarette. The other sits in a winter press room as that cigarette finally identifies its smoker. Between them lie changing technologies, aging witnesses, and countless ordinary days of waiting. The Curran siblings occupied a still longer span, because their connection to Rita began before any case number existed. Police records could tell them where the investigation had gone, yet family memory held the years before Brooks Avenue, when Rita was simply their sister. That earlier life remained untouched by the identity of William DeRoos and larger than the circumstances of her death. Tom spoke with compassion about his parents, who had relied upon family, faith, and one another in an era offering fewer formal services for grieving relatives. Their daughter's case entered newspapers and police files, while they continued through the private routines of home. The eventual answer belonged partly to them, even though it arrived too late for them to hear it. Mary's memories returned toward music, preserving Rita through something audible rather than forensic. A harmony is created when separate notes remain distinct while fitting together, and perhaps that image suits the investigation as well. The cigarette, witness account, family tree, and fabric test each held a different note until their relationship became clear. After the announcement, news reports traveled far beyond Burlington, often reducing the case to the arresting simplicity of a cigarette that waited 52 years. That phrase was accurate in outline, but the true work inside it was slower and more communal. The cigarette waited because many people kept it, revisited it, funded testing, built records, and refused to let an unanswered profile become the final page. You can return now to the evidence room, away from cameras and public statements, where the physical object remains small and unremarkable. Its filter does not glow with meaning, and its paper bears no visible family tree. Everything learned from it required procedures, instruments, comparisons, and human judgment arranged around a trace that could not explain itself alone. The phrase DNA evidence sometimes creates an impression of certainty, arriving all at once, like a key turning smoothly in a lock. In practice, old samples may be partial, mixed, damaged, or present in quantities near the limits of detection. Analysts must decide which methods to use, how to control contamination, and how strongly the observed markers support one proposition over another. The cigarette sample was valuable because it produced a clear male profile suitable for comparison, while the clothing samples contained mixtures requiring more cautious interpretation. A single source profile is easier to reason about than several contributors occupying the same test result. That difference explains why the cigarette became the reference point, and the fabric provided additional support. If you picture a printed electropherogram, you may see peaks rising along a horizontal line, each associated with a genetic marker examined by the laboratory. Analysts study their heights, positions, and relationships, looking for the pattern left by one or more contributors. The page may appear technical and distant, yet it is simply another way of recording biological inheritance. Short tandem repeats are regions where small sequences of DNA repeat a varying number of times, creating combinations useful for distinguishing people. A forensic profile examines several such locations, and the complete pattern becomes uncommon enough for meaningful comparison. The method does not describe a person's character, memories, or appearance. It only supplies a precise biological signature. The genealogy work generally relies upon a broader set of markers spread across the genome, allowing researchers to identify segments shared through common ancestors. Longer shared segments tend to suggest closer relationships, while smaller amounts may indicate more distant connections. The genealogist measures those segments, estimates possible kinships, and then turns toward documentary records for context. You need not follow every technical distinction as you rest beside the file. The important thing is that forensic comparison and genealogical searching answer different questions. One asks whether evidence profiles are consistent with the same contributor, while the other asks which extended family contains the unknown person whose profile was found. The Rita Curran cigarette served both purposes across different stages of the investigation. First, it provided the unknown male profile against which other evidence could be compared. Later, its genetic material allowed researchers to search for relatives, turning a nameless forensic pattern into a documented family line. Each use required some portion of an old and limited sample, which made planning important. Laboratories cannot assume that evidence will remain endlessly available after repeated testing, especially when the item is small. Detectives and scientists therefore discussed which examination offered the greatest chance of useful information, while preserving whatever remained for possible future review. That restraint is another form of patience, rarely visible in public accounts. A team may know that a new method exists, but wait until its performance improves or until adequate funding becomes available. Acting too early can consume material without producing a usable result, while waiting too long can burden families and allow witnesses to fade. In the Curran case, the timing depended upon several advances aligning. The cigarette had already yielded a traditional profile. Forensic genealogy had become established enough to generate a responsible lead, and newer laboratory methods could examine mixed material upon the preserved clothing. A cold case grant then helped place the necessary testing within financial reach. Season of Justice, an organization supporting investigative work in unsolved cases, contributed funding for part of the renewed analysis. That assistance mattered because advanced testing and genealogical research require trained specialists, laboratory time, and extensive documentary work. A small department may possess the will to reopen a case while still needing outside help to follow every technical path. The grant connected donors and administrators who never knew Rita personally to a cigarette collected before many of them were born. Their contribution did not replace police work, but it allowed promising evidence to move from a shelf to a laboratory. You can hear the paper of the funding application turning beneath someone's hand, another quiet document within the larger investigation. Once the samples reached the Florida laboratory in March of 2022, scientists worked through the priority items selected by Burlington police. Some pieces carried only Rita's DNA, while others held mixtures requiring detailed statistical analysis. Every result returned to the detectives with notes about its strength and limits, making careful reading as important as the testing itself. The wooden fragments and section of linoleum offered no useful unknown profile beyond material associated with Rita. That outcome did not weaken the cigarette evidence. It simply meant those particular surfaces had not preserved an interpretable trace from another person. You place those reports in the file without disappointment, because honest science records unhelpful results with the same attention given to helpful ones. The housecoat told a different story at the molecular level, containing a mixture in which the cigarette contributor was strongly supported. Fabric can collect cells through contact, although the exact moment and manner of deposition cannot always be determined. The result therefore connected the same male profile to Rita's clothing, without claiming to reconstruct every movement within the room. Statistical language protected the analysis from becoming more certain than the data allowed. Rather than saying the profile simply belonged to the cigarette smoker, the report compared how likely the findings were under competing explanations. The ratio of approximately 65,000 to 1 on the housecoat gave strong support, while the smaller ratio on the underclothing offered limited but consistent support. Those categories may sound restrained beside the emotional importance of the case, but restraint is what makes forensic language dependable. A scientist serves the investigation best by resisting dramatic terms and explaining uncertainty plainly. You can imagine the analyst rereading each sentence before release, ensuring that no phrase wanders beyond what the peaks and calculations can show. Detectives performed a similar task when combining the laboratory result with circumstantial evidence. They did not multiply unrelated suspicions until they sounded impressive, nor did they ignore the possibility of innocent transfer. They asked whether the total pattern made reasonable sense under competing explanations, always returning to the cigarette's location, William's proximity, and the false alibi. Considered separately, an upstairs neighbor might have entered a downstairs apartment on some harmless occasion. A cigarette in a shared residence might also have an ordinary explanation, and a witness might misremember an argument after many years. Considered together with matching biological material and a genealogical identification, however, those possibilities became increasingly difficult to arrange into an innocent account. The evidence was cumulative, meaning its strength came from the way different pieces reinforced one another. Genealogy pointed toward William. Original reports placed him upstairs. Michelle placed him outside during the window, and laboratory work connected the smoker to Rita's clothing. No one result needed to perform every task, because each answered a narrower question. This division of labor among evidence is much like the detective team itself. One investigator could specialize in interviews, another in records, while technicians and genealogists carried different expertise. They met around the same table, where a fact discovered by one person could alter the question asked by another. You can picture a large timeline fixed to a wall, with copies of photographs and reports placed along its length. The 19th of July occupies only a narrow section, while the years afterwards stretch across more space than any room could easily hold. Colored notes might mark evidence testing, witness interviews, and family contacts, each date showing how slowly the case learned to speak. At one end is Rita's return to the apartment, the telephone call, and her roommate's departure. At the other is a winter announcement in 2023, where detectives name the man indicated by the preserved evidence. Between those points, the cigarette spends most of its existence in darkness, sealed from light and ordinary handling. That darkness was protective rather than ominous. Stable storage reduced exposure to moisture, sunlight, and contamination, giving fragile biological material its best chance to endure. The evidence room required no dramatic atmosphere, only controlled habits, clear labels, and workers willing to treat an old packet as carefully as a new one. Over the decades, evidence management standards improved, and departments became more aware of the future value hidden in biological traces. Items once discarded after a case grew inactive were increasingly recognized as potential resources for technologies not yet developed. The Curran cigarette became a powerful example of why preservation decisions should be made with humility about what tomorrow may know. An officer in 1971 could not foresee polymerase chain reaction, national DNA databases, or public genealogy matching. What that officer could foresee was simpler. An object near Rita might matter, and discarding it would make every future question impossible. That modest judgment created a bridge longer than anyone present could imagine. The bridge also depended upon documentation. If the cigarette had survived without a reliable record of where it was found or how it was handled, its later profile would have been far less useful. Location gave the object context, while chain of custody gave later investigators confidence that the sample still belonged to the Rita Curran scene. You turn the original evidence notation toward the lamp and notice how few words were needed to preserve that context. An item description, a position near the right arm, a date, and the collector's identifying mark created a factual anchor. The handwriting may be faded, but its practical meaning remained clear enough to guide scientists 5 decades later. This is why patient detective work often appears ordinary while it is happening. It consists of completing forms, sealing packages, checking dates, and writing down where something rested before it was moved. Only years later does one of those routine acts reveal itself as the hinge upon which an entire identification turned. The press conference honored that continuity by mentioning those who collected and maintained the evidence long before the renewed team assembled. Some were retired, and others had died without seeing the result their work made possible. Their contribution survived in labels, photographs, and the intact filter held within the evidence packet. After the public announcement, people who had lived in Burlington during 1971 reconsidered their memories of the case. Some recalled newspaper headlines, conversations at work, or the unease that followed Rita's death. Others knew the story only as the city's oldest unresolved homicide, a phrase repeated so often that it had begun to sound almost permanent before the cigarette changed it. Current residents of the Brooks Avenue building had lived with that history in a quieter form. An old case can attach itself to an address, passing from tenant to tenant through local stories and occasional questions from reporters. The rooms continue serving ordinary life, with groceries on counters and shoes beside doors, while the past remains a faint layer beneath the present. You can stand outside number 17 in imagination without turning it into a monument of fear. It is a house within a neighborhood, altered by time and occupied by people whose lives have nothing to do with 1971. What happened there belongs to history, while the building continues through seasons of rain, snow, leaf fall, and sunlight. Burlington changed around it as well. The university expanded, cars and clothing changed, and Lake Champlain continued reflecting the western sky much as it always had. Through all those changes, Rita's case remained part of the city's memory, carried by police officers, journalists, residents, and family members who refused to let her become merely an old headline. The identification of William DeRoos corrected one long-standing uncertainty, but it also required public accounts to revise how the case was told. Speculation about famous offenders and unknown intruders gave way to the quiet fact of an upstairs neighbor whose name had appeared in early reports. History narrowed from many imagined possibilities toward one evidence-supported answer. Journalists interviewed detectives and family members, translating forensic genealogy into language readers could understand. The simplest version centered on the cigarette, because a tiny discarded object, surviving 52 years, offered a clear image. Yet responsible reporting also included the changed alibi, the clothing tests, and the patient work required to move from DNA to a name. Without those supporting details, the story could seem almost magical, as though a laboratory placed the cigarette into a machine and received William's identity. The real process was more human and more interesting in its quiet way. It depended upon judgment, memory, public records, funding, family cooperation, and the willingness to check every apparent connection. You can return to the genealogist's desk after the announcement, where the completed tree still contains all the branches that did not lead toward Burlington. Those branches were not wasted work. because they established the structure needed to isolate the correct intersection. Each verified cousin and ancestor helped define who the unknown person could and could not be. Some records may have arrived as digital images, while others required requests to clerks or searches through subscription archives. A name spelled differently across two documents could require an hour of comparison, and a second marriage might explain why one branch appeared to disappear. The work rewards steadiness more than inspiration, because families are built from ordinary records accumulated across time. A genealogist must also guard against confirmation bias, the natural tendency to favor information supporting an emerging theory. If William's residence made him seem promising, the family tree still had to be built according to genetic and documentary evidence rather than shaped toward him. Independent lines from both parents helped protect the result from that kind of distortion. Detectives faced the same discipline when interviewing Michelle. Knowing the genealogy result could influence how they heard her answers, so specific recollections needed to be recorded and compared with contemporary reports. The value of her statement came not from its emotional impact, but from its consistency with facts established by other means. Her mention of the argument supplied a reason William left, but the investigation could not verify every detail of the disagreement. It did not need to. The critical factual change was his absence from the apartment and the request for a false account, both of which fitted the window already established in 1971. The 70-minute interval itself came from roommates' movements and telephone contact, not from later scientific estimation. Around 11:15, Rita was understood to be asleep while the final roommate prepared to leave. By approximately 12:30, returning occupants had discovered that something was wrong in closing the relevant period between ordinary social events. Such timelines always contain small uncertainties around clocks, travel, and recollection, especially before mobile phones and digital records. Investigators therefore treated the times as approximate rather than pretending every minute was fixed. Even with that margin, William's unexplained outing remained comfortably within the period that mattered most. Proximity made the interval practical. A person elsewhere in Burlington would need travel time and some knowledge that Rita was alone, while an upstairs resident could notice movements within the building and cover the distance quickly. This observation did not prove intent, but it helped explain why William fit the circumstances better than distant names once considered in the file. The original canvas had already preserved his presence before anyone knew that presence would matter. Officers did not have to reconstruct his address from memory 50 years later, because the reports placed William and Michelle within the building. That contemporary documentation joined the modern DNA result, like two pieces prepared in different eras for the same purpose. You may notice how often the case depends upon things written down before their significance became apparent. The cigarette's position, William's address, Michelle's alibi, and the roommate's timing all survived because someone recorded them. Later, investigators could challenge interpretations, but they did not need to invent the underlying facts. This is what a well-kept cold case file offers. Not certainty preserved in advance, but enough detail for future minds to ask better questions. Its pages hold mistakes, assumptions, and dead ends alongside valuable observations. The task is to separate them patiently, listening for what remains consistent when new methods are applied to old material. The Rita Curran team did this by treating the case as current, while respecting its age. They brought energy to the review, but did not pretend witnesses were still young or evidence was unlimited. Every interview, test and record search acknowledged the long interval, turning that limitation into a reason for greater care. When the case was publicly closed, the physical evidence did not lose its importance. It remained part of the permanent record, available for review if new questions or challenges emerged. Closure changed the administrative status and the department's conclusion, but responsible preservation continued beyond the moment cameras left the room. The reports from 2023 joined those from 1971 inside the same institutional history. Fresh white pages now sat beside yellowed originals, their type clean and their terminology shaped by modern science. Between them rested the cigarette packet, the one object that had been present before either generation understood the full story. For the family, public attention gradually receded after the announcement, as it does even after an answer long awaited. Reporters completed their articles, cameras were packed away, and headquarters returned to its everyday sounds. Rita's siblings continued carrying her memory in the quieter spaces where it had always lived, beyond the reach of official language. You can imagine Tom returning to thoughts of his parents, considering what they might have felt upon hearing William's name. No one can answer that precisely, and it is kinder not to assign them reactions they could not express. Their years of waiting remain part of the case, a reminder that delayed truth arrives into a family already shaped by its absence. Mary could return to music, to the sister whose voice had once occupied a place beside hers. Recordings may fade, and singers may be remembered only by those who heard them. Yet harmony leaves a bodily memory of breath and timing. That is a different kind of evidence, private and tender, preserving the person whom police science could never fully describe. The detectives, meanwhile, continued organizing the completed inquiry so another reader could follow its reasoning without relying upon verbal explanation. Reports identified which tests were performed, which alternatives were considered, and how the genealogy lead was corroborated. A closed case still deserves a readable trail, because confidence should remain open to informed review. That written clarity mattered especially without a trial. In court, prosecutors, defense attorneys, experts, and a judge would test the meaning and admissibility of each piece. Since William's death prevented that process, the investigative record had to show both the strength of the conclusion and the limits that remained unchanged. Police could identify him as the person responsible within their case findings, but they could not produce a judicial conviction after death. A careful listener can hold those facts together without weakening either one. The evidence convinced the department, while the absence of trial means the conclusion rests within an investigative rather than adjudicated framework. Such distinctions may feel formal, yet they protect the integrity of every case, old or new. They prevent compassion for a victim from becoming permission to overstate evidence, and they keep scientific confidence separate from legal verdict. In the quiet study of the Curran file, exact language becomes another way of showing respect. You turn now toward the supplemental reports written after the public announcement, where detectives record final contacts, evidence status, and administrative decisions. The pages do not end the human story, but they bring order to the official one. A pen moves across a signature line, the ink briefly glossy, before it dries into another durable mark. Nearby, the Lark cigarette remains protected from unnecessary handling. Its filter has surrendered enough material to connect a long, unidentified profile with a family, a neighbor, and Rita's clothing. Yet scientists may preserve what remains because future methods can sometimes answer questions no current analyst has thought to ask. The lesson of its first 52 years encourages that humility. No one in 1971 could describe how a genealogy database would help identify a smoker through distant relatives. It would be equally unwise for investigators in 2023 to assume that modern science represents the final boundary of what evidence can reveal. So the packet returns to controlled storage, bearing old labels and newer documentation, while the copies used for presentation settle into the case file. The evidence room door closes with an ordinary mechanical click, and the lights leave rows of boxes in a steady, climate-controlled dark. On one shelf, the Curran cigarette waits again, no longer nameless, while another report is opened beneath the detective's lamp. The report beneath the lamp concerns the cigarette's final movement after testing, but its plain language reaches back toward the first morning of the investigation. An evidence custodian verifies the seal, notes the condition of the package, and returns it to its assigned place. You follow the signature into the ledger, where one more line quietly extends the chain of custody. The word chain can sound rigid, though the reality is made from individual acts of attention. One person receives the packet, another checks its identifying number, and a third confirms when it leaves for examination. If any gap appears, later questions become harder to answer. So the uneventful completeness of the record carries its own kind of strength. In the Rita Curran file, those routine exchanges connected a summer bedroom to laboratories in New York and Florida, then onward to specialists working with genealogical data. The cigarette crossed state lines without losing its documented identity, while reports followed in separate envelopes and electronic files. You can picture each arrival being logged beneath cool office light, the old object entering another modern system. The process also protected Rita's family from an answer based upon uncertain material. Before attributing a profile to William DeRoos, investigators needed confidence that the filter truly came from the Brooks Avenue scene and had remained reliably associated with the case. Preservation served not only science, but the emotional responsibility of naming someone after so many years. A mistaken identification would have caused another wound, attaching false certainty to an already painful history. That possibility encouraged the team to repeat comparisons, check family branches, and examine the old address records again. You sit with their caution and feel how patience can become a form of kindness when the consequences of error are personal. The next pages take you back to the first evidence inventory, where physical objects are described without knowing which will matter most. There are pieces from the room, clothing, fibers, photographs, and the distinctive cigarette. The list possesses the dry texture of administration, yet every line records something removed from a place that could never be reconstructed in exactly the same way. Scene photography in 1971 depended upon film, measured exposure, and careful placement of the camera. Investigators could not review an image instantly on a screen, so they made several photographs and trusted method to preserve what their eyes saw. The shutter opened for a fraction of a second, capturing the cigarette in position before it was lifted into evidence. Film then required development, a chemical process performed away from the apartment, where images emerged gradually from blank-looking material. You can imagine trays beneath subdued light, the clean medicinal odor of developer, and wet photographs hanging until their surfaces dried. Only then could detectives study details at a desk and compare what the camera preserved with their written notes. Modern investigators reopened those photographs as high-resolution copies, enlarging small areas without touching the aging originals. The Lark filter could be examined visually alongside the report describing its uncrushed condition and the ash beneath it. A detail recorded by one generation became available to another through the combined patience of chemistry, storage, and careful scanning. The floor plan offered another quiet aid, reducing the apartment to walls, doors, and measured relationships. A drawn rectangle cannot capture the warmth of a room or the character of its occupants, but it can show distance and access with reliable simplicity. You move your attention from the shared bedroom toward the hall, then toward the stairs leading to the units above. The physical arrangement helped the renewed team reconsider opportunity without depending entirely upon memory. William did not need directions from across the city, nor did he need a vehicle to reach the building. He already knew the entrance, the stairs, and the ordinary rhythm of people living within that divided house. Yet the floor plan could not reveal whether he had spoken with Rita before that night, or whether they had exchanged any casual greeting as neighbors. Investigators found no established relationship that explained the cigarette's presence beside her. You leave that absence in its proper place, neither enlarging it into proof nor dismissing its quiet importance. A shared address creates possible contact, but it does not create an innocent explanation automatically. Neighbors may pass upon stairs without entering one another's rooms, and people occupying the same building can remain almost strangers. The team weighed those ordinary possibilities against the location of the filter and the matching material upon Rita's housecoat. You can feel the housecoat fabric only through imagination, because evidence should remain sealed and protected. It may have softened through washing before that summer night, its ties and folds carrying the familiar texture of everyday clothing. Under laboratory light, those same fibers offered microscopic surfaces where cells from more than one person had remained caught. Mixture interpretation required the analyst to separate Rita's known profile from the other observed markers. Once her contribution was accounted for, the remaining peaks could be evaluated against the male reference developed from the cigarette. The work involved calculations, thresholds, and quality controls rather than visual resemblance, keeping the conclusion grounded in reproducible measurement. Statistical ratios do not tell us when contact occurred, which is why detectives retained the surrounding context. The condition of the room, the cigarette's position, William's opportunity, and Michelle's altered account helped explain why the shared profile mattered. Science supplied identity information, while the original scene supplied temporal and physical meaning. You turn to the underclothing report and notice more cautious wording because its statistical support was lower. The result remained consistent with the cigarette contributor, but the laboratory classified its strength accordingly. A trustworthy file allows two findings to carry different weight, resisting any temptation to flatten them into the same degree of certainty. This distinction helped the investigators present their conclusion honestly. The stronger housecoat result could serve as meaningful corroboration, while the more limited result remained a smaller supporting element. Neither had to be exaggerated. because the genealogy and neighborhood evidence were already moving toward the same person. The laboratory reports also documented controls designed to detect contamination or procedural error. Blank samples accompanied portions of the process, reagents were tracked, and analysts recorded the instruments and methods used. These details may appear almost invisible within the public story, yet they are the quiet framework that allows a result to be trusted. You can imagine a technician changing gloves, cleaning a surface, and opening only one item at a time. The room is bright, the bench cool and smooth, and every tube carries a label too small to read from across the room. Patient movements reduce the chance that modern handling will confuse material preserved from the past. The cigarette itself had been handled before current DNA precautions became standard, which made controls and interpretation especially important. Officers in 1971 collected evidence according to the knowledge of their era, without masks and protocols designed around trace genetics. The successful profile therefore reflected both fortunate preservation and modern care during later testing. Investigators considered whether a responder or evidence worker could account for the male DNA, comparing what was known about handling and the profile's genealogical direction. The family tree result pointed toward William, who had lived at the scene rather than worked within the evidence system. His address and withdrawn alibi provided an independent reason the laboratory profile belonged within the inquiry. Had the profile led toward a police officer, medical examiner, or laboratory employee, contamination would have required serious examination. Instead, the genetic path arrived at a resident whose name appeared in the original canvas. That convergence allowed the team to understand the profile as evidentiary rather than an artifact of later handling. The small amount of ash beneath the cigarette contributed another layer to the scene interpretation. Ash is delicate, easily shifted by a shoe, a draft, or the movement of fabric, and its presence suggested the cigarette had finished burning where it lay. You can see the pale dust in the photograph, almost without weight, yet preserved by the camera after the physical particles were disturbed. The cigarette had not been deliberately extinguished against a hard surface, according to investigators who later described its condition. Its tobacco end appeared uneven, consistent with a cigarette allowed to smolder until it went out. That observation did not identify the smoker, but it connected the filter more closely to the room and the relevant period. Perhaps the smoker dropped it without noticing, or perhaps attention had shifted elsewhere before it could be put out. The record cannot recover the intention behind that motion, and we will not supply one. What remains is the object itself, its ash, its location, and the genetic material protected within the charcoal filter. Lark cigarettes had entered the American market during the 1960s and used a distinctive filter containing charcoal granules. Advertising presented that design as a feature, while smokers simply recognized the brand by its package and taste. In Rita's room, the construction offered investigators a visible identity for the cigarette, long before biology offered the smoker's identity. A brand inquiry could only travel so far. Detectives might ask whether a witness recalled William smoking larks, but tobacco habits are shared, changed, and imperfectly remembered. You set those questions to one side because the filter's DNA eventually provided a firmer association than any remembered package on a kitchen counter. The cigarette waited through a period when smoking was common in homes, offices, restaurants, and public spaces. A discarded butt, in many locations, would have attracted little attention, which makes its careful collection at Brooks Avenue notable. The scene and its position gave an ordinary object potential meaning, and the officer preserved it without knowing how rare that decision would later seem. As years passed, cultural habits changed around the evidence, while the packet remained untouched. Indoor air gradually cleared in many public places. Brands disappeared from shelves, and the once familiar smell of smoke became less common. The lark butt changed from a recent trace into an artifact of its era, though its forensic value continued quietly to increase. You can feel time in that contrast, not as an abstract number, but through changing textures and sounds. Typewriter ribbons gave way to toner cartridges, rotary telephones to mobile screens, and paper maps to digital searches. The cigarette crossed all those transitions inside a sealed envelope, carrying information deposited before the first generation of personal computers reached ordinary desks. The Rita Curran investigation also crossed changes in policing itself. Departments developed specialized evidence procedures, cold case strategies, victim support practices, and access to national databases. Each development offered another way to revisit the file, though none could replace the original decision to collect the small item from the floor. Cold case review often begins with an inventory rather than a theory. Investigators ask what evidence still exists, how it was stored, which items have been tested, and what portion remains available. You can imagine the Curran box opening beneath a records room lamp, its familiar contents receiving fresh numbers on a new review sheet. The reviewer then compares current capabilities with earlier examinations. A test that produced nothing in one decade may succeed in another, while an item never considered biological may contain touch DNA or another useful trace. This comparison between old material and new methods is less dramatic than an interrogation, yet it often supplies the most promising cold case path. Detective Jeff Beerworth's decision in 2014 to submit the cigarette and other evidence represented exactly that kind of review. He could not know that the national database would return no match, nor that genealogy would later identify William. He knew only that modern DNA testing might recover a profile, and that possibility was sufficient reason to try. When the male profile emerged, the case gained a durable reference, even though no name accompanied it. Investigators could compare it with future suspects, exclude people, and wait for databases to grow. The profile became another preserved object in its own right, stored digitally and within laboratory reports, while the cigarette returned to the shelf. A no-match result can feel like a closed door, but databases are not static. New profiles enter as laws, convictions, and investigative submissions change, making periodic searching worthwhile. The Curran profile remained available for such comparison, though William's absence from the criminal database meant an exact hit never arrived through that route. Genetic genealogy offered a side entrance by asking about relatives rather than William himself. This approach became more visible after several long unsolved cases were resolved near the end of the 2010s. Detectives across the country began reassessing preserved samples, learning where the method worked well and where privacy, policy, or sample quality imposed limits. Burlington's team sought specialist help rather than treating the technique as a simple database search. Genealogists understood relationship ranges, public records, and the many ways real families depart from tidy diagrams. Their expertise turned partial genetic connections into investigative leads that detectives could then test against addresses, ages, and timelines. You may picture a distant match sharing only a small portion of DNA with the unknown smoker. That match alone could represent several possible relationships, perhaps extending through grandparents whose descendants spread across many states. The researcher works backward to shared ancestors and forward again, checking each branch until geography and generation begin to align. Marriage records become especially useful because surnames can change and families can appear to vanish from one record set. Obituaries gather children, siblings, and places into compact notices, while census documents place households together at particular moments. Each source has limits, so genealogists prefer agreement among several records before accepting a relationship. The Curran tree eventually produced connections through both parental sides of William de Roos, giving the researchers two independent routes toward the same family intersection. That pattern reduced the likelihood that they were following a coincidental surname or mistaken branch. You can see the lines approaching one another slowly on the page until William's generation comes into view. Then ordinary police research took over again. Genealogy could suggest family members, but detectives needed to determine who had lived near Rita and who could fit the unknown smoker's profile. William's presence at the building transformed him from one descendant among several into the person demanding the closest attention. The original reports preserved more than his address. They showed that police had spoken with William and Michelle during the immediate neighborhood canvass, making clear that both were present in Burlington when the case began. Their statements could be read against one another and against the later interview without relying solely upon reconstructed residence records. When investigators found Michelle decades later, they approached someone whose own life had traveled far from that brief marriage. She had changed her name and lived across the country, while William had been dead for many years. The old question arrived, not as an accusation against her, but as an invitation to correct what the original file had preserved. You can imagine the pause before she described the argument and the walk. Memory may return through fragments, a door closing, the emotional temperature of a room, or the words spoken when police appeared later. Detectives listened for what she remembered independently and what could be checked against the narrow timeline. Her account explained why two consistent statements in 1971 had not reflected the truth. They were consistent because William had instructed her what to say, not because both people independently remembered him remaining home. That distinction turned apparent corroboration into evidence of concealment, though the detectives still considered Michelle's youth and emotional circumstances. She had been newly married and believed William's criminal history might make police suspicious of him unfairly. Protecting him may have felt like loyalty rather than participation in something larger. You can hold her younger self and older honesty in the same view, allowing complexity without losing sight of the false alibi. William's request also showed that he understood his absence could matter to investigators. It did not reveal what he did while away, and it could not serve as a confession. Placed beside the physical evidence, however, the request became another fact pointing toward consciousness that the true timeline should remain hidden. The renewed team searched for any innocent context that might explain his DNA upon the cigarette and Rita's clothing. No documented friendship or social visit supplied such an account, and Michelle's statement placed him outside during the relevant period, rather than visiting openly at another time. The possibilities narrowed through absence of explanation, combined with positive evidence. Investigators also spoke with William's later wife, who described behavior that caused concern during their relationship. Her recollections could not establish what happened in Burlington, and the team treated them as contextual rather than identifying evidence. You close that transcript without dwelling upon its painful details, keeping the focus on the patient proof within Rita's case. This restraint protects everyone in the file from being reduced to the worst event attached to their name. Rita remains more than a victim, Michelle more than an alibi witness, and William's later wife more than a source of corroboration. A compassionate investigation seeks truth while remembering that every document opens onto a life larger than its typed paragraphs. Even William, identified by police as responsible, must be described through what evidence supports rather than embellished into a figure of imagined darkness. Sensational language would add nothing to the DNA, the timeline, or the false statement. You can let the facts remain plain, because plain facts are strong enough when carefully assembled. The case's enduring interest comes not from violence, but from the survival of a clue and the patience required to interpret it. A cigarette, almost discarded by definition, remained protected longer than many buildings, careers, and marriages endure. Its value unfolded only because successive investigators resisted the idea that age had made the file useless. There were undoubtedly moments when the case appeared unlikely ever to yield a name. Witnesses aged, suspects died, and early forensic avenues produced no decisive result. Yet, the file remained open to review, which is different from promising that an answer will arrive. It simply preserves the possibility that one might. You sit with that distinction in the archive room, where patience has no guaranteed reward. Many evidence boxes remain quiet, despite every careful effort, and investigators must accept that uncertainty without abandoning good practice. The Curran cigarette was exceptional because preservation, science, and genealogy eventually aligned, not because waiting always produces the same outcome. That uncertainty makes the original preservation more admirable, not less. Officers saved the cigarette without assurance, and later detectives ordered tests that might have consumed resources without advancing the case. Each decision involved judgment under incomplete knowledge, which is the ordinary condition of patient work. The family also practiced a kind of patience, though it was never something they freely chose. They answered calls, considered theories, and lived beside an unanswered question while the rest of life continued. Their endurance should not be romanticized, but it deserves acknowledgement as part of the long human history surrounding the evidence. Rita's parents watched investigative eras pass without hearing a name they could trust. Her father's work at international business machines placed him within another world of changing technology, while the technology needed for his daughter's case developed too slowly to reach him. That coincidence carries a gentle sadness through the family record. Her mother, a nurse and active member of the Milton community, continued serving others while carrying her own private loss. She lived until 2002, still years before forensic genealogy became a practical route in the Curran investigation. You can imagine her hands arranging ordinary household things, the unanswered file existing somewhere beyond her daily view. The parents relied upon faith, family, and the forms of support available in their community. Modern victim services had not yet developed into the organized resources now offered after serious crimes. Their grief entered no standardized assessment, and much of it remained within church, home, and the quiet company of people who knew them. Tom later remembered that earlier world without resentment toward those who could not provide what did not yet exist. His attention remained on Rita and their parents rather than on William, a choice that gently returned the center of the story to the family. You can follow that direction whenever the evidence begins to make the identified man seem larger than the person whose case it was. Rita's life had been full of beginnings in 1971. She was pursuing further education, trying her first home away from family, and preparing for another school year. The apartment may not have suited her, but even that discomfort belonged to the ordinary process of discovering how one wishes to live. She had spoken about moving again, which tells us she was evaluating her surroundings and imagining a next step, a new address, another roommate arrangement, or a return towards something more familiar may have waited only weeks ahead. Those possibilities remain gentle outlines, never completed, but still part of the future Rita expected to have at the Colonial Motor Inn. Her summer work followed a steady pattern of rooms made ready for strangers. Sheets were drawn smooth, towels folded, and small traces of previous guests removed before the next arrivals. There is a quiet dignity in such work, and it mirrors the attention to detail that would later characterize the investigation bearing her name. Her graduate courses suggested another form of patience, the willingness to spend summer hours studying when the regular school year had paused. Books, notes, and assignments belonged to the life of a teacher still learning. You can picture a pencil resting across an open page, afternoon light moving slowly along the margin while Burlington traffic hums beyond the window. Music gave Rita a place outside work and study. Barbershop harmony depends upon breath, timing, and careful listening, with no single singer overwhelming the others. The ensemble creates overtones that seem to hover above the written notes, a warm sound produced through close human attention. Those memories remained available to her family when the police file offered only dates and evidence. A sister can restore tone and movement to a photograph, while a brother can recall family habits no detective ever needed to record. The complete Rita existed within those recollections, not within the laboratory designation attached to a sample. Cold case teams increasingly understand that family knowledge can guide investigations without reducing relatives to sources of information. A respectful detective explains delays, asks permission where appropriate, and makes space for memories unrelated to the crime. In the Curran investigation, communication with Tom and Mary connected the technical work to the people who had carried Rita's absence the longest. Family members can also preserve documents, photographs, and correspondence overlooked by official files. A dated letter may clarify travel. A snapshot may identify a friend, and a remembered conversation may direct attention toward an address. Even when such materials do not solve the case, they keep the victim's life visible to those studying the evidence. You return to the public presentation photographs, where Rita's face appears beside charts explaining a cigarette profile and genealogy tree. The arrangement risks making her seem like one component among many, yet the detectives repeatedly return to her name and family. Every branch and laboratory number existed only because Rita's unanswered death continued to matter. After the announcement, forensic professionals elsewhere studied the case as an example of combined methods. The successful path began with traditional collection, moved through short tandem repeat profiling, and eventually used genealogical relationships supported by renewed physical testing. Each stage had its own standards, limitations, and required expertise. For evidence managers, the lesson concerned preservation. A small object should not be discarded merely because present methods cannot extract useful information, especially when its relation to the scene is well documented. Space and resources are finite, but irreversible disposal closes possibilities that no later scientific advance can restore. For detectives, the lesson concerned returning to the original neighborhood rather than being guided solely by later speculation. William's name was not discovered through a new rumor. It had waited in the earliest reports. Genealogy made it possible to understand why that ordinary entry deserved renewed scrutiny. For genealogists, the case demonstrated the value of two-sided family connections and careful documentary confirmation. A genetic lead becomes most persuasive when independent records place the candidate where the event occurred. The Brooks Avenue address supplied that rare and exact intersection between inherited markers and historical place. For laboratory analysts, the case showed how a single-source cigarette profile could guide interpretation of more complex mixtures upon clothing. The known-unknown profile, developed years earlier, gave scientists a comparison point when newer items were tested. You can appreciate the odd phrase known-unknown because the profile was scientifically clear long before its owner was named. For families, the lesson may have been less technical and more difficult. Evidence can survive longer than hope feels comfortable surviving, and an answer may come after those who asked first are gone. The Curran siblings received something real, but it arrived carrying the unmistakable quiet of delay. For you, sitting with the file tonight, the method asks only that you notice the small acts connecting one decade to another: a camera shutter, a sealed envelope, a database search, and an older witness correcting her statement. Each moved the inquiry forward. None needed urgency, and none benefited from noise. They required steady attention. The case also invites patience with uncertainty, because even a solved identification leaves portions of the night beyond recovery. Investigators could establish a responsible conclusion without claiming omniscience. You can let what is known remain clear, and what is unknown remain open, trusting the boundary between them as part of honest work. We do not know the precise conversation, if any, between Rita and William before he entered her room. We do not know whether the cigarette was lit shortly before his arrival downstairs, or carried already burning. Those questions rest outside the available evidence, and filling them would only replace silence with invention. We do know that the cigarette was recovered beside Rita, that it yielded a male profile, and that the same profile received support upon her clothing. We know genealogy led toward William's family from both sides, and that he lived upstairs during the relevant period. We also know his original alibi did not survive Michelle's later account. These facts can be held without arranging them into a dramatic reenactment. They are sufficient to understand the detective's confidence, and their measured presentation respects the limitations imposed by time. You turn each fact like a photograph beneath the lamp, looking carefully and then setting it back in its proper order. The order matters because chronology prevents later knowledge from distorting earlier actions. Officers in 1971 did not overlook an obvious DNA solution because no such solution existed. Detectives in 2014 did not fail when the profile produced no database hit because genealogy had not yet become their available path. Likewise, the renewed team in 2019 did not receive an immediate name simply by reopening the box. They reviewed the case, sought funding, located specialists, and waited for analysis that continued into 2022. The eventual announcement rested upon several years of contemporary work, layered over decades of prior care. Patient investigation often proceeds through these pauses. A sample waits in a laboratory queue, a records request crosses a county office, and a genealogist verifies one uncertain branch before moving farther. The waiting is active in its own way, filled with safeguards that keep speed from weakening the result. You can hear this pace in the office after most staff have gone home. A printer releases another report, the heating system breathes through a vent, and a detective circles one date with a soft pencil. Outside, Burlington settles beneath winter darkness, while a July timeline remains open upon the desk. The detective may return to the same paragraph several times, noticing that William's name appears in more than one canvas document. Repetition across reports can reveal whether a statement remained consistent or whether details changed between interviews. In this case, the consistency of the early alibi reflected coordination, a possibility visible only after Michelle explained its origin. Original notes are especially valuable because formal reports sometimes compress the hesitation and sequence of an interview. A crossed-out word, an added time, or a marginal notation may show which detail required clarification. You can almost feel the slight indentation left by a ballpoint pen as the renewed investigator studies the old page. Not every mark carries hidden significance, and careful readers resist treating ordinary corrections as clues. The goal is not to make every faded detail mysterious, but to understand what the writer intended to preserve. Patient reading allows mundane entries to remain mundane until independent evidence gives one of them a legitimate new meaning. William's address had that kind of transformation. At first, it simply identified another resident contacted during canvassing. After genealogy linked the cigarette to his family, the same address became proof of extraordinary proximity, and after Michelle withdrew the alibi, it placed an unaccounted-for man only moments from Rita's door. The facts changed in significance without changing in content. This is one reason old files reward fresh review by a team unfamiliar with the assumptions that shaped earlier reading. A new detective sees the same sentence with fewer habits attached and may ask why a neighbor's name appears repeatedly without deeper examination. Treeb's decision to gather several people around the file supported that freshness. One team member might focus upon physical evidence, another upon witness statements, and another upon witness timeline. Their separate observations could be discussed openly, reducing the chance that one persuasive theory would direct every subsequent step. Collaborative review also distributes the emotional weight of difficult material. No single detective has to carry every photograph, family conversation, and unresolved question alone. In a quiet conference room, colleagues can pause, compare impressions, and return the focus to evidence when emotion begins to cloud judgment. The Rita Curran case had passed through enough hands that no one could claim ownership of the eventual answer. Beerworth's testing, Treeb's team approach, Chenette's interview, genealogical research, laboratory analysis, and original evidence collection all remained essential. The result belonged to a chain of patient work rather than a single heroic moment. That truth fits the cigarette itself, which carries no drama when separated from the story built around it. It is paper, filter material, ash, and biological residue, ordinary substances held in an extraordinary context. You can see it lying beneath clear protective packaging, small enough to overlook and too important now to discard. Its weighting was not conscious, of course, though the image helps us understand the passage of time. The filter did not know that Rita's siblings were aging, or that William had died. It simply remained chemically present while human knowledge developed around it, an unintentional message protected until someone could read it. There is comfort in that material steadiness, provided we do not confuse it with justice arriving automatically. Evidence survives only when people preserve it, and technology helps only when investigators obtain resources and use it responsibly. The Curran cigarette waited because a long sequence of human choices allowed it to wait. Another page in the supplemental file records media inquiries after the announcement. Detectives answered questions about the genetic method, William's death, and why the case had taken so long. Each answer returned to the same reality. The necessary science had not existed when the cigarette was found, and later progress arrived in stages rather than all at once. Some listeners wondered why William had not been recognized immediately as a suspect if he lived upstairs. The old alibi provides part of the answer, along with the crowded nature of an early investigation and the absence of physical tools linking him to the room. Hindsight makes a path look straight only after the destination is known. In 1971, detectives faced many names, uncertain accounts, and a city unsettled by other reports of troubling behavior. They followed leads according to what witnesses and physical examination could then provide. You can disagree with particular choices while still recognizing that modern knowledge changes the apparent shape of the earlier maze. The cigarette's later profile did what intuition could not. It selected one biological contributor from among the many people discussed in the file. Genealogy then selected a family, and historical records brought the inquiry back to William. This route avoided relying upon which old suspect seemed most memorable or culturally familiar. The exclusion of well-known possibilities was as important as the identification. It allowed the family and public to leave behind theories that had absorbed attention for years without fitting the physical evidence. A case grows quieter when unsupported names are removed, and that quiet makes room for what the evidence can actually say. You may now close the folder containing those discarded theories, feeling the softened corners settle beneath your palm. It remains part of the investigative history because every responsibly checked path explains how the team reached its position. Yet it no longer needs to stand open beside the cigarette photograph or the DeRue's family tree. The next folder concerns Rita's family correspondence, letters and contacts extending across years when no decisive update could be offered. Some entries likely contain only a date, a caller's name, and a brief notation that the investigation remained active. Such sparse language can hold a great deal of weighting between its lines. A family member may call after seeing a documentary, reading an article, or remembering a detail discussed long before. The detective listens, checks the file, and explains what can be shared without giving false hope. Even when nothing changes, answering with patience confirms that the person at the center has not been forgotten. Those contacts connect generations of detectives, just as the evidence log does. A new officer reads how a retired colleague spoke with the family and tries to maintain the same steadiness. The voice on the telephone changes, but the duty remains: to be honest about uncertainty and attentive to the human being behind the case number. When meaningful progress finally occurred, that history of contact shaped how the news was delivered. Detectives understood that the siblings had lived through promising names that did not endure. They presented the genealogy and laboratory work carefully, giving the family evidence rather than asking them to trust excitement alone. You can turn one of those contact pages slowly, noticing the difference between the brief typed entry and the conversation it represents. A few lines cannot capture the silence after a difficult question or the tone in which a sibling says Rita's name. The file preserves enough to guide the next detective, while the rest remains within human memory. The correspondence also reveals how a cold case continues outside the department. Family members speak with journalists, preserve photographs, and keep public attention from disappearing entirely. Their persistence is not the same as investigative authority, yet it can help an old file return to the desk when new scientific options emerge. In Rita's case, renewed public interest appeared before the final answer, including local reporting that revisited Burlington's oldest unresolved homicide. Such attention can generate tips, but it can also revive speculation and emotional strain. Detectives must receive useful information without allowing publicity to replace evidence as the guide for their work. The family navigated that balance for decades. Sharing Rita's story kept her visible, while every retelling risked centering the mystery more than the woman. You can restore the balance by returning again to the teacher, singer, student, and sister whose ordinary summer plans were interrupted before they could continue. One photograph may show Rita posed neatly, as people often were when film was limited and each exposure mattered. The image cannot reveal the movement of her hands while speaking, or the expression that appeared when music settled into harmony. Those living details survive through family recollection, warming the colder surfaces of police records. Another photograph may show the apartment exterior, its porch steps and windows arranged in summer light. Investigators see access points and unit locations, while a resident might notice paint, curtains, or the familiar angle of the roof. The same image holds different meanings depending upon who sits before it and what they have come to find. For you, the house can remain a place of quiet study rather than unease. You approach it as the detective who arrives after the streets have emptied, carrying no urgency because the evidence has already waited so long. The wood beneath the porch rail feels smooth from years of hands, and leaves make a soft sound along Brooks Avenue. Inside, the narrow stairs offer a sensory measure of William's proximity. A few steps, a landing, and an interior door separate one household from another, while ordinary sounds travel through old construction. The distance is short enough that no car engine or lengthy absence would have announced his movement to the neighborhood. The apartment's shared nature also complicated the evidence. Multiple residents and visitors could leave hair, fingerprints, fibers, and biological material, making context essential when analysts encountered mixtures. The cigarette's location and single-source profile helped distinguish it from the diffuse background expected within communal rooms. Rita herself was not known as the smoker of that lark, and the profile confirmed a male contributor. Investigators therefore treated the filter as belonging to someone whose presence required explanation. Once genealogy pointed toward William, the ordinary possibility of household background became increasingly difficult to apply to that particular object. The renewed team would still ask whether William had been invited inside at another time. No reliable account established such a visit, and the smoldered cigarette appeared connected to the immediate scene rather than stored household debris. The supporting clothing result tightened that connection without requiring speculation about every earlier encounter. You can see how context gives weight to trace evidence. DNA upon a public door handle may tell little because many people touch it, while DNA upon a privately worn item inside a narrow event window can matter greatly. The molecule is the same, but the surrounding facts determine its investigative meaning. That principle guided the team's cautious language in public. They did not say DNA alone solved the case, despite the cigarette's central role. They described genealogy, additional testing, neighborhood proximity, witness re-interviewing, and William's later history as parts of a broader assessment. Public shorthand nevertheless returned to the cigarette, because it offered a tangible center for a story extending across 52 years. We can use that center without forgetting everything around it. The filter waited, but people carried, protected, questioned, and interpreted it through successive chapters of the investigation. When the press room emptied, the presentation boards and microphones were removed, leaving an ordinary municipal space once again. Family members departed with an answer that would continue settling long after the cameras stopped. Detectives gathered their notes, checked whether every item had been returned, and moved toward the quieter administrative work that follows a public announcement. A case closure requires records to be updated, databases corrected, and evidence status confirmed. Notifications may be sent to agencies that once contributed information, allowing them to close associated inquiries or amend their files. These steps rarely enter retellings, but they ensure that the answer reaches every institutional place where uncertainty had been stored. The name William DeRoos would now replace the unknown designation in some records, though the original laboratory profile remained preserved as generated. Analysts do not rewrite old data to fit a later conclusion. They link the identification through supplemental documentation. You can see the new page clipped behind the old one, maintaining both chronology and transparency. The suspect list likewise received final annotations showing why other names were excluded or no longer relevant. This prevents a future researcher from reopening a discarded theory without seeing the evidence that resolved it. Good closure leaves a trail clear enough for another careful reader to reproduce the essential reasoning. The family notification was documented, along with the public statement and the basis for administrative closure, because no prosecution could follow. Those records became the formal endpoint of active police work, yet the larger file still contained correspondence, photographs, and reports that invited slower consideration beyond the narrow question of identity. You open one such folder now, its paper carrying the faint dry smell of storage and its metal fastener cool beneath your fingertips. Inside are copies of newspaper articles from the weeks after Rita's death, their columns narrow and their print slightly uneven. The first headlines ask for information, while later ones mark the passing days without an arrest. The articles show how quickly a present investigation becomes a public memory. Early reports use immediate language and quote officers still working long hours, while anniversary pieces speak from increasing distance. You follow the changing verbs and notice the gradual movement from police are investigating to police continue to hope. Rita's photograph appears repeatedly, sometimes cropped closely, and sometimes placed beside a broader account of the neighborhood. Each reproduction loses a little detail, especially in old newsprint, until her features soften into dots of black ink. The family's original photographs preserve far more, held away from newsroom presses and handled with greater care. A reporter returning to the case after 10 or 20 years might interview retired investigators and ask which clue still troubled them. The cigarette could be mentioned as one among many items. Long before its DNA profile existed, its significance grew retrospectively, which is why older articles may not give it the prominence later readers expect it to have. This difference reminds you not to read the past as though everyone already knew the ending. In each decade, detectives worked with only the science and information then available. The cigarette became a biological key slowly, and until the lock of genealogy existed, its potential remained more theoretical than practical. The newspaper clippings also preserve the language of their era, some of it less sensitive than words chosen today. A patient reader can extract facts without repeating descriptions that reduce Rita to what was done to her. We keep our attention on the investigative response, the evidence, and the people who waited for answers. One article may mention the unusually brief opportunity window, another the continuing search for anyone who noticed movement near the building. These public appeals asked ordinary residents to examine ordinary memories. A parked car, an illuminated window, or footsteps on a porch might have seemed trivial until placed beside the timeline of Rita's final evening. Human memory does not preserve every ordinary detail equally, and publicity can alter how certain a recollection feels. Detectives, therefore, compared late tips with statements recorded closest to the event. You can appreciate the value of those first canvas notes again, written before years of repeated stories could reshape the night. Among them sat William and Michelle's shared alibi, accepted because it appeared internally consistent and because no physical evidence then contradicted it. The later DNA did not merely add a new clue, it gave detectives a reason to return to that particular statement. Technology pointed back toward a human conversation that needed to happen again. The case might therefore have remained unresolved even with genealogy if Michelle had been unavailable or unwilling to speak. Conversely, her changed account, without DNA, might have raised suspicion, but not supplied a reliable identification. The solution depended upon both scientific innovation and one older witness choosing to tell the truth. That partnership is easy to overlook when attention stays fixed upon the laboratory. A family tree can name a promising person, but interviews reveal movements, relationships, and the reasons earlier records may be wrong. Patient detective work moves between instruments and conversations, giving neither complete authority over the other. Chinette's interview required listening rather than confrontation. After 50 years, urgency would not improve memory, and accusation might have closed the path toward honest correction. You can imagine his voice remaining level while he asks about the apartment, the argument, and what William said after police came to their door. The sensory details of that distant evening may have helped Michelle orient herself. She might remember the newness of the marriage, the arrangement of rooms, or the emotional residue of the disagreement more readily than an exact clock time. Investigators used the established timeline to place her account without demanding precision that memory could not responsibly supply. When she acknowledged the lie, the admission corrected a foundational piece of the original investigation. It also showed how a small instruction within a private marriage could delay understanding for decades. You need not judge her harshly to recognize the consequence, and you need not excuse the consequence to understand the fearful young woman who caused it. The detective's public comments reflected that balance. They treated Michelle as a witness who had finally provided essential information, not as someone knowingly protecting a murderer for half a century. Compassion did not weaken the investigation. It allowed the account to be heard within the complexity of its human setting. You close that transcript and place it beside the genealogy report, feeling how different the two forms of evidence are. One is a human recollection shaped by time, and the other is a technical reconstruction shaped by inheritance and records. Their agreement becomes meaningful because they arrived through such separate paths. The cigarette profile existed before Michelle revised her statement, and her statement concerned William's movements without depending upon the laboratory mixture calculations. The independence reduces the likelihood that one result merely repeats the assumptions of another. This is the quiet architecture of corroboration, built from materials that meet only after each has been examined on its own. Another document records William's death, fixing the date and place that made prosecution impossible. He died in San Francisco on the 7th of August, 1986, in a hotel room after an overdose. The record is brief, and we leave its circumstances without embellishment, noting only how early his life ended and how long the Curran file continued after him. His death occurred before DNA profiling had become broadly established in American criminal investigations. Had the cigarette produced a name earlier, authorities might have had the opportunity to interview him or seek a reference sample. Instead, scientific timing and human mortality passed one another without meeting. That missed possibility cannot be repaired, and the investigators did not pretend a police conclusion could substitute fully for court proceedings. They could close the case administratively, based upon confidence in the evidence, but no judge or jury would evaluate William's responsibility. The distinction rests quietly in the file beside every statement of certainty. For Rita's family, the lack of prosecution may have mattered differently, at different moments. An answer can relieve uncertainty while awakening thoughts about accountability that will never occur. You allow those feelings to remain varied and private because no family owes the public a single, tidy response to delayed truth. The case file itself offers no tidy emotional ending, only an orderly investigative one. Forms can be completed, status fields changed, and the identified name entered, while memory continues outside those boxes. This is why we remain with the papers a little longer, turning toward another bundle tied with archival string. Inside are photographs and notes from Rita's life before Brooks Avenue, materials that return the atmosphere from laboratory white to the softer colors of family rooms and school days. A teacher's portrait, a musical program, and perhaps a handwritten note carry textures no DNA chart can provide. You settle them beneath the lamp carefully, preparing to read the next quiet page. The warmer records leave Rita where her family always kept her, among music, teaching, familiar rooms, and the small plans of a life still unfolding. You can let the laboratory language grow quiet now, while her photograph remains beneath the gentle circle of the lamp. The case was about evidence, but the waiting was always about a person. For more than half a century, the cigarette preserved what memory and ordinary investigation could not identify, until careful science connected its smoker to William DeRoos. The additional DNA, his place in the building, and the withdrawal of his alibi gave Burlington police confidence that he was responsible. It was an answer reached slowly, through preservation, restraint, and the steady work of people who accepted that old evidence still deserved their attention. The Rita Curran case is now officially solved and closed by the Burlington Police Department, though William DeRoos was never arrested, tried, or convicted, because he died many years before investigators identified him. No courtroom could hear the evidence, and no sentence could follow the finding. Rita's family received the name they had awaited, while also carrying the quiet truth that the answer had come too late for their parents. You may set down the weight of the file now, leaving every careful label and measured conclusion where it belongs. Outside the archive, Burlington settles into another night, and the old house on Brooks Avenue stands among ordinary windows, passing seasons, and the softened sounds of people returning home. Somewhere in that stillness, a remembered harmony lingers after the singers have lowered their voices, while the lamp dims over Rita's photograph and the little cigarette rests at last in silence.